Content warning, themes of emotional, mental, and sexual abuse, trauma, suicide, and homework. In this video, I'd like to take the time to explore the subject of mental health, especially in the context of content creators. We'll be talking about what mental health is, how it can be impaired, the effects of poor mental health, a variety, but by no means an exhaustive list, of everyday problems to look out for, and a couple personal anecdotes from my own experience, suffering mental illness, becoming a target of abuse, my resulting time as an abuser, and my recovery. I'm Shout, by the way, nice to meet you. Before we start, if you or anyone you know is currently in a mental health crisis, this might not be the video for you. In the description after the handful of sources and further reading will be a link to various crisis hotlines that can help you deal with any immediate problem. In case you're not up for a long, serious video right now, and I'll be trying to throw around some jokes here and there, but we're going to be literally talking about abuse, so no promises. In the description there are also links to a couple videos I personally enjoy in case you need to take the edge off. Don't worry, I understand, come back later. Similarly, if the video ever becomes too much for you and you need to take a break, don't worry about it, it's a video, it'll be here when you're ready. But I wouldn't worry too much. I did just say no promises, but I promise that this video has a happy ending. Furthermore, before we get started, I'd like to thank the channels Philosophy Tube and Thought Slime for their contributions to this topic, and if this video helps you at all, I'd like to encourage you to check out their videos on abuse and mental health as well. Ollie even had a run-in with codependency too, so if that strikes a chord with you, he's got a great video called Men Abuse Trauma, worth checking out. And Todd S. Lyman has another video called The Uncomfortable Truth About Mental Illness, about his experience with shame and anxiety that is also very much worth your time. Links in the description. And honestly, just by speaking up, just by putting that information out there for people to parse and understand, they've done so much for me and presumably people like me. Their contribution to the conversation have had a large hand in inspiring me to speak up about myself. So, if either of them are watching, hey! How did you get here? Anyway, sorry about all that forward. Now, on with the show. So, mental health, right? We've gotten a lot better about talking about mental health in the past couple of years, but there can still be a certain kind of stigma about engaging with this topic. For instance, it's a very sensitive topic, and there are a lot of moving parts, and some people, for whatever reason, even refuse to acknowledge its existence as a whole. But there's actually a lot of information out there now. Between public figures like YouTubers and streamers and game devs all sharing their stories, and the sheer signal range that they get out of modern social media, there's never been a better time to learn about mental health just by making sense of other people's lived experiences. It's a lot of information. See, if you do any research into mental health and mental illness, and manage to put aside how uncomfortable it is to chew through another human being's honest lived experience suffering, there's a lot of information out there! Like, there are all sorts of studies and all sorts of statistics. Like, off the top of my head, according to NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, the American National Alliance for Mental Illness, almost 1 in 5 adult Americans dealt with some kind of mental health problem in 2018, and about 1 in 5 of those, so 1 in 25 Americans, were so seriously affected that it substantially interfered with or limited one or more major life activities. But numbers have the opposite problem. See, statistics are cold and inhuman and hard to understand without knowing the language. So it's easy to see how someone can feel shut out, like there's no obvious point of entry. So if we were to learn something from all this, where would we even start? Where do you begin to learn about mental health? For the sake of argument, let's try Google. Let's try define mental health. Quote, mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, from childhood and adolescence through adulthood. Mental health refers to your emotional and psychological well-being. Having good mental health helps you lead a relatively healthy and happy life. It, parentheses, also, unparentheses, helps you demonstrate resilience and the ability to cope in the face of life's adversities. Quote, mental health is the overall wellness of how you think, regulate your feelings, and behave. Sometimes people experience a significant disturbance in this mental functioning. Okay, I'm beginning to see a pattern. It kind of sounds like mental health is like physical health almost? Not like the presence of something, but the absence of any illness. Like how you can say you have your health when you aren't sneezing your ass off and all your bones are intact and all your blood's still in your body. And when you have your health, you're able to do more things that you want to do, like play sports and locomote and not die of blood loss. So maybe mental health is not the presence of something, but the absence of mental illness, which is also a pretty loaded term. One common and extremely incorrect trope is that mental illness injures your sanity, Like your grip on reality is a uniform resource, and as your sanity falls lower and lower, you start to act crazier and crazier until ultimately you're in the fetal position, doomed to jabber about old ones for the rest of your miserable life. Fortunately, I think we're mostly beyond that. Cthulhu doesn't get a lot of mileage in the DSM. But a more subtly wrong trope is the idea that mental illness is caused exclusively by chemical imbalances in the brain, and should be treated almost like a disability because people literally cannot help themselves. Specifically, this theory was more popular in the 80s and 90s, but it was eventually disproven and is something kinda like a myth today, or even biotruthing. It is partially correct, but it is for the most part not the case. You do not need to be a literal neurosurgeon to do something about poor mental health. This is because mental health is predominantly psychological. In other words, it is concerned with one's behavior and one's mind. While the mind can be affected by physical conditions, for instance, if you're drunk or have been hit on the head or have a brain tumor or something, the mind also has its own internal conditions, for instance, mindsets and beliefs and behaviors, that affect the way you think and feel. And, of course, the study of these psychological conditions is known as psychology. That's what those definitions are missing. What exactly is becoming unhealthy? Now we're getting somewhere. So, in order to improve your mental health, maybe all you need to do is learn to take better care of your mind, which can be a lot more straightforward than it sounds. If unhealthy behavior is not caused by your brain squirting the wrong bio-goo, and it's caused by some kind of mental system in the brain, some kind of behavior or mindset or whatever the fuck that I just said, then all we have to do is work out what those systems are and how to deal with them. So maybe, at the core of mental health, is a kind of understanding. An understanding of how and why you do the things that you do, and an understanding of the context around you, and an understanding of your own needs and desires. And as a result, you can use that understanding to make more constructive or healthy decisions that can help you and those around you live a happier life. And, if at any point, some kind of habit or dogma or misinformation or some kind of other psychological factor interrupts someone's ability to make those healthy decisions by damaging that healthy understanding, we can call that factor mentally unhealthy. Maybe that explains some of the stigma, the idea that mental health is, for lack of a better term, all inside your head. The type of problem that could be solved by someone knowing better. Unlike with normal-ass health, where if you're obviously missing a whole fucking leg, nobody's gonna get mad at you for not being able to run a marathon or kick a field goal or perform Swan Lake exclusively for bipeds. Nor is there anything you can really do about it from your place of one-leggedness. But with mental health, where it sounds like that could be the case, any failure to recover could be interpreted as some kind of failure of willpower. But maybe that's missing something too. Maybe that's another kind of misunderstanding. See, these are the kinds of questions we're trying to answer here. Not necessarily full-on scholar-level psychological theory, but how mental health can interact with our practical reality. Not to dismiss theory, obviously, just that a degree is not necessarily our goal. We're just trying to work out how to deal with our problems. So, maybe we should start with the mundane stuff, the everyday bullshit that everyone has to deal with, and work our way up to more extreme circumstance. So, let's say you have this friend, and your friend hasn't gotten out of bed in a while, and you're trying to get your friend out of bed, and your friend doesn't want to get out of bed, and you have little to no understanding of psychology or mental health, and you have a dick for a nose. So, if someone were to ask you what was wrong with him, you might describe your friend as just being lazy or selfish, or maybe he's just weak and has to be stronger and has to toughen up. But honestly, you have no idea what the fuck is going on. Like, you don't even think poorly of the guy. Like, if he was just weak or selfish or lazy or whatever, you'd accept him. That's just the way he is. What's more important to you is that he just gets better already. But because mental illness doesn't have a tell, in your head it could be anything. Or maybe you just don't know what you're looking for. So, let's say your friend, we'll call him Bedman, and call you Dick Nose, is what people would call a content creator. You know he's some kind of artist, and you know he works on the internet. You also know that he works for himself, and his job involves constantly producing art that is then constantly consumed by lots and lots of people he's never met before, then constantly parsing their feedback to put that feedback into practice for his next piece of art. And then he does all of that all over again. And what's more is that he does this super fucking fast! Like, he's not like a filmmaker where he puts out like one film a year or so. He puts himself through this cycle like monthly, or like weekly, or even like daily sometimes. But he says he's okay, like he actually enjoys working. Like, whenever you hear of Bedman, he's always working flat out to meet some kind of deadline that he sets for himself, of course. Because he's grateful to his audience for giving him the opportunity and he doesn't want to let them down. They're letting him live the dream, after all. And most of the time, he makes it. Sometimes he doesn't, but either way, he's always hard at work. Every day. All the time. Quote, stress generally refers to two things. The psychological perception of pressure, on the one hand, and the body's response to it on the other, which involves multiple systems from metabolism to muscles to memory. Now, Bedman probably realizes that he's under a lot of pressure, because the guy works for himself. His company, for lack of a better term, only has the one point of failure, and that point of failure is Bedman. If he fails to make a deadline, or his content dips in quality, or he says something stupid on the internet, Bedman only really has himself to blame. But again, he's okay with that. Unlike a real company, Bedman doesn't have to go through any middle managers or red tape or anything like that to work out the cause of any problem. It can only possibly be something to do with Bedman. And because it can only possibly be something to do with Bedman, it's that much easier for him to isolate and then fix any given problem. Then he can get right back to doing his job again, and he knows better not to make the same mistake next time. And nobody else can do any of that for him because there's nobody else in the quote-unquote company. He has to make all those decisions himself. And that's just the way Bedman likes it. Hell, you could almost say that Bedman runs on pressure. When faced with an environmental stressor, Bedman's brain is wired to increase activity, burn more oxygen, and siphon energy from the body's secondary systems, like the digestive and immune systems. All this extra energy allows him to think faster, and learn faster, and act faster to deal with any perceived threat. And this quote-unquote stress response isn't even some kind of freak mutation or the result of years of training. People use stress every day to study for tests, and escape burning buildings, and chase down criminals. You could even say that humankind is built to thrive in these stressful situations, and now Bedman's found a way to cheat the system, and keep himself constantly stressed. So, what the fuck? What's this guy doing in fucking bed? Doesn't Bedman know he has fucking deadlines to meet? See, psychologically, the stress response is a stress response. It's the body's automatic, or rather, autonomic, response to perceived danger. And over a long enough period of time, exposure to these perceived dangers could lead to another powerful psychological phenomenon called adaptation. A proclivity toward a certain behavior or thought pattern. If Bedman happens into some action that lowers his stress in the presence of a particular stressor, he is more likely to, consciously or unconsciously, perform that action again when faced with a similar stressor. Kind of like Darwinian adaptation, where organisms that suit a particular environment tend to reproduce. Autonomic just means involuntary and unconscious. It comes from the term autonomous. So, for instance, your heartbeat is autonomic because you're... Autonomic? Because your heart will beat without you having to think about it. So, in the same way, when faced with a perceived danger, your stress response will just kinda go, and you don't really have a lot of control over it. However, due to the physical side effects of stress, and the nature of his stressors, Bedman's adaptations are more likely to do more harm than good. If his problem is that he's, say, not making his deadlines, then he could decide to stop eating, or stop sleeping, or stop taking care of himself in order to put more hours into his work. And these strategies, which are especially common amongst content creators, who usually don't have a lot of other activities to cut, could be informed by the nature of the stress response, which pulls power from the digestive system so you don't feel hungry and floods you with the hormone cortisol so you feel more awake, among other things. It doesn't really matter that there isn't actually any food in your stomach and that you haven't had any sleep in like 3 days, because in the moment, with what information your body is giving you, you could feel like you're making the right decision. Now, if any of these adaptations actually manages to solve the problem, the adaptation could very well stick, which is already unhealthy enough on its own. But even if an adaptation doesn't actually solve the problem, if Bedman doesn't catch himself, he could still hold on to the adaptation anyway. And now the poor guy is photosynthesizing and slamming 6 packs of Red Bull for literally no benefit whatsoever. Adaptation dickery could even cause a feedback loop. If your strategy to cope with not working fast enough is to spend more of your lunch working, but skipping meals makes you too hungry to work, you could just make yourself more stressed and even less able to work. This could even affect your judgment, so even if you're aware enough to realize that you're in a vicious cycle, you might make simple mistakes that you wouldn't make otherwise. Like, for instance, deciding to stay hungry because you think it's helping your quote-unquote work ethic. Finally, if Bedman can't deal with a problem with either his basic quote-unquote reflex stress response or any of his more cerebral adaptations, he could predict that the problem will occur in the future and try to get the jump on it by anticipating the problem in advance. For instance, if he's had to escape 3 burning buildings this week, Bedman might become worried that his house might catch fire next, and start sleeping under a pile of fire extinguishers. This anticipation is also called anxiety, and is a whole new bag of worms. Anxiety is, according to anxiety.org, an associate of the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, the mind and body's reaction to stressful, dangerous, or unfamiliar situations. It's the sense of uneasiness or distress or dread you feel before significant events. and a certain level of anxiety helps us stay alert and aware. So if stress is a response to an environmental stressor, then anxiety is a response to stress, a response to a response. And like stress, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Let's say, for instance, that part of the reason why Bedman works so hard is not only because he has to deal with the present stress of meeting his deadlines, but also because of the future fear that failure to meet deadlines could cost him his reputation, his audience, or worse. And he doesn't know this for sure or anything, it's not like he's ever lost his job before, but he has seen it happen to other people, and he has heard horror stories. So we can call this anxiety something like an educated guess. Now, Bedman might not actually be in a situation where if he stops working, any of those things will actually happen, but he doesn't know that, nor does it actually matter. Just the uncertainty is enough for him to start worrying about the future. Especially if he's coming from a position of stress which could directly or indirectly inhibit his judgment, anxiety can be downright irrational. If I don't make my deadlines, Bedman might think, then one of my fans might come to my house and shoot me with a gun. That kind of thing. And again, like stress, anxiety can lead to further anxiety. If one of my fans comes to my house and shoots me with a gun, Bedman might continue to think, then I won't be able to make my deadlines, which means I won't be able to make rent, which means my landlord will get mad at me, and I'll be dead, so I won't be able to do anything about it. Or, to be even more transparently self-perpetuating, if I don't make my deadlines, I'll get anxious, which means I won't be able to make my deadlines. These spirals are key features in what psychologists refer to as personality disorders. Self-perpetuating patterns, like stress responses creating more stressful situations, or anxiety begetting further anxiety, that obstruct an individual's ability to meaningfully adapt to their environments. In particular, stress is one of many risk factors for developing what is called an anxiety disorder, possibly because of that altered judgment. Other factors also include genetics, environment, and even aspects of your personality, like, for instance, a tendency to fall into these feedback loops. But, hypothetically, let's say Bedman isn't caught in a loop. He isn't anxious about losing his job because he's anxious about losing his job. He's anxious because a threat keeps appearing in his actual environment. If this anxiety was purely psychological, that is to say that there's no genetic or environmental elements or whatever muddying the waters, you could think of this anxiety as a kind of adaptation as well. If Bedman knows he's going to be stressed out, then he might begin to anticipate being stressed out in order to plan to deal with being stressed out in advance. If there really is pressure in his environment for Bedman to worry about, this anxiety is, for lack of a better term, healthy. It could give him early enough warning to formulate a plan that does not involve losing sleep or skipping meals, resolving both his anxiety and dealing with the external pressure. However, if Bedman is so on the lookout for environmental stressors that he becomes stressed by something he would otherwise find non-threatening, for instance, if Bedman is so vigilant for potential problems that he mistakes something as small as a quick typo as a serious problem, Bedman could, just like with stress, mistakenly internalize harmful information. Psychological literature calls behavior like this maladaptive, a behavior that inhibits your ability to adjust healthily to particular situations. In other words, a behavior developed to adapt to a problem, but only really makes the problem worse. Like, for instance, the downward hunger spiral that we were just talking about. In fact, like the downward hunger spiral, maladaptive behaviors can not only exacerbate the problem that they were designed to deal with, but make it harder for someone to adapt to their environment as a whole. For now, let's put a pin in the concept of maladaptive behavior. We'll come back to that one later. This pattern of mental health problems piling up on top of each other will quickly become a recurring theme. So we've learned now that stress and anxiety are both characterized by a sort of nervous energy as a result of the physiological mechanics of the human stress response. However, this nervous energy is finite. There's only so much spare power you can get out of your secondary systems before you've got nothing left to give, and both your brain and your body grind to an exhausted halt. When someone is exposed to so much stress so constantly that they're constantly experiencing this mental exhaustion, some people would say that they're suffering burnout. Burnout is a reaction to prolonged or chronic job stress and is characterized by three main dimensions: exhaustion, cynicism, and feelings of reduced professional ability. The stress response, for lack of a better term, was designed for short-term applications, not long-term background noise. A million years ago, when our ancestors spent all day avoiding predators biting their balls off, the stress response helped them physically fight their enemies or physically run the fuck away from their enemies. However, in the modern day, we can't fight or flight all of our problems away. We encounter fewer predators, for one thing, and when we do, they usually aren't animals. And even if we could just literally run away from our bosses, we would still have to come into work the next day. However, we haven't stopped being stressed either. We've just started to respond to different stressors. Stressors that we cannot escape. At least, not without losing our jobs. And just like how high stress can affect your judgment, burnout can also affect your judgment. Some people, especially content creators, especially on a time crunch, might not even realize that something is wrong per se, because they're focusing what little energy they have left on their work, not on diagnostics. At best, they'll understand what other people tell them, that their output is failing, and their workplace is a mess, and they've missed 12 deadlines this week, and they're beginning to smell. Actually, hold on a second. Let's put burnout aside for a paragraph, and let's talk about another common content creator problem. Have you ever heard of something called imposter syndrome? Imposter syndrome is a psychological pattern where somebody internalizes a fear of being revealed as a fraud, or that their accomplishments are just a bunch of lucky breaks, or that they were never good at their job and have never done anything but waste everyone's time, or they otherwise do not deserve their success and someone else out there deserves it more, despite any evidence to the contrary. This pattern of thinking seems to stem from a sense that someone is out of place. For instance, it's especially common in individuals who don't conform to stereotypes, or stigmatized groups, such as the LGBT community, with an unfortunate overlap in the middle. But 70% of people will deal with imposter syndrome at some point in their career. This can lead to, among other problems, stress and anxiety. So if someone's suffering from the effects of burnout, and is thus suffering from the long-term effects of stress, and their judgment is shot, and their productivity is shot, and they don't know what's going on besides what other people tell them, and there's that creeping fear in the back of their head that maybe they were never any good at their job, and their whole charade is falling apart, and their friend with a dick for a nose called them lazy like 10 minutes ago, imposter syndrome could feel like less of an irrational fear, and more like an awful reality. And without the energy to resist, or even a good reason to think that they should, a quote-unquote imposter could find themselves simply overwhelmed. The first thing to know about depression is that there are two types of depression. There's depression, which is a short-term condition that is considered part of the span of what is considered normal human behavior, and then there's depression, which happens over a longer term and is classified as a true mental illness, a quote-unquote disorder. Some people call the former situational depression, grief, or just straight-up sadness, and the latter is referred to as major depressive disorder, or clinical depression. Situational depression can be triggered by events like loss of a loved one, sickness, relationship problems, or vocational problems, like burnout. It is part of the span of normal human behavior in the sense that everyone gets sick, everyone has problems, and everyone loses loved ones. In contrast, major depressive disorder is a long-term disorder, think months instead of weeks, that can have roots in all sorts of problems, like relationship problems and genetics and actual chemical imbalances. It's kind of like how there's anxiety, and then there's anxiety in the form of anxiety disorders. Quote, situational depression is generally brought on by a stressful situation. In this case, the person feels overwhelmed by a situation that also exhausts their coping abilities. The symptoms often subside as the situation comes under control or becomes more manageable. This is different from clinical depression, where there is no identifiable cause. And sometimes people will start with a situational depression that develops into a clinical depression. Common symptoms of situational depression include sadness, hopelessness, regular crying, constant worrying or feeling anxious or stressed out, sleeping difficulties, disinterest in food, trouble focusing, trouble carrying out daily activities, feeling overwhelmed, avoiding social situations and interaction, not taking care of important matters like paying your bills or going to work, thoughts or attempts at suicide, and lack of enjoyment in normal activities. Bedman has been in bed for like 2 weeks now, and Dick Nose just doesn't know what to do. Bedman isn't eating, he isn't sleeping, he isn't working, which usually cheers him up. He's just been staring up at the ceiling. Dick Nose has tried everything too. He's brought him food, he's brought him blankets, he's dragged a 100-pound CRT into the guy's bedroom and physically shoved air right into his hands, and nothing's working. And now Dick Nose is watching this video, and he's feeling kinda spooked because the host keeps mentioning him by name, and not a lot of people are named Dick Nose. But now Dick Nose is actually taking the time to do more research than none at all, between what he's learned on the internet, okay, what he's learned on Google, and what he knows about Bedman. Dick Nose thinks he has a pretty good idea of what Bedman's problem is. He's depressed because he isn't able to work, and because he can't work, he thinks he's worthless. Probably because Dick Nose called him lazy before. That does make sense. But all this talk about worthlessness gives Dick Nose an idea. If the problem is that Bedman feels worthless, then maybe all he has to do is make him feel loved. So Dick Nose goes around and gathers up all of Bedman's friends together and explains the situation, organizing what can only be described as an after-school special. And all of Bedman's friends agree to help cheer him up and show him that they care about him, and that he isn't a fraud, and that he is the best at whatever it is that he does. But even when they all crowd into his house and start making happy surprise party noises in his living room, Bedman still won't get out of bed, even to see what's making all the noise. It's like he isn't listening. Thankfully, Dick Nose has a clue as to why. He's watched enough of this video to think that maybe, because Bedman is feeling so worthless, he's deliberately isolating himself by hiding in his bed so his worthlessness won't bother anyone else. However, by isolating himself, Bedman has refused to accept any evidence that he's loved. In other words, he's caught in one of those loops again. Dick Nose, circa like 10 minutes ago, might have called Bedman difficult, or spoiled, or ungrateful, or even think that the guy wants to be depressed. But now that he's done more research than literally no research at all, he knows that not only is that not the case, but that kind of thinking won't solve the problem. So, to Dick Nose, all that's going on here is that his friend won't get out of bed, and now it's really beginning to worry him. But it also looks like he's reached an impasse. If things stay the way they are now, then Bedman might stay like this forever, but it's also looking more and more like there's nothing that he can do. But that can't be right. Right? Quote, hope underpins the recovery process of mental illness, as recovery depends on the notion that a patient desires to get better. This makes hope the route by which recovery occurs. So we're about a fourth of our way into this video, and we've covered 4 ways that everyday life, especially as a content creator, can impact your mental health. In particular, we've talked about stress, anxiety, burnout, and depression. And again, this is by no means an exhaustive list. These are just a handful of common mental health problems that even otherwise healthy individuals have to deal with every day. Now, before we continue into segment 1.1, I would like to point out that in the comments section there should be a pinned comment with more resources, including the resources that I studied in researching in these videos, in case you would like to know more about any topic that we've touched on, or if you would like to do the research for yourself. More on that later. While mental illness can seem hopeless, like a kind of thing that you just develop and you have to deal with for the rest of your life, like high blood pressure or arthritis, especially to anyone currently stuck in its grasp, mental illness is not a permanent condition. Mental illness doesn't corrupt your personality, mental illness isn't just a part of you, and nobody is their mental illness. And mental illness can be beaten. Humans were not designed to lie down and die. When nothing is bothering us, when we're hungry, we want to eat, and when we're thirsty, we want to drink, and when we're tired, we want to sleep. And these seemingly innocuous instincts are actually robust, self-preserving systems that help humans meet their physical needs so that they can pursue their more high-minded goals. These instincts can be overwritten, but only if something short-circuits our thinking. Under conditions like stress or anxiety or depression, that self-preservation, something like that will to live, could be warped or ignored in favor of maladaptive learned behavior. But once that short circuit has been corrected, that robustness can work for you again, and life can return to normal. And the first step to that recovery is to hold out hope. To hope that life can get better. This video will have a happy ending. Recovery is always possible. And nobody is too far gone. It is midnight now in Bedtown. Dick Nose and company have all gone home for the day, leaving Bedman, who Bedtown is not named after, Bedman is a common name, leaving Bedman alone with his thoughts. He's still staring up at the ceiling and wondering where everything could have gone wrong, re-examining his life with a new, darker lens. If he really has been a fraud, like it wasn't just imposter syndrome, he was just, I don't know, refusing to accept the truth. If he really was just lying to himself about all of his accomplishments and all his skill really was just dumb luck, how else has he been deluding himself all this time? Did he ever have friends, or does everyone just put up with him? Is he actually any good at his job, or do people just come to him for their fix? Do people even tolerate him? Like, at all? Can people tell that he's a fraud? And if they can, why could they tell and he couldn't? How can he even trust his judgment if his judgment could be so wrong? How much of his life is a lie? Let's take a step back for a second. All of that is totally absurd, right? You don't even know the guy. You don't know Bedman. You don't know his life. You don't know his background. You don't even know what he does, really, beyond that he is a content creator. But when you hear some actual bullshit like this, it makes you want to grab the poor guy by the shoulders and say something like, "It's okay! Everyone makes mistakes sometimes. You're not a liar. You're just being too hard on yourself." A line like that indicates compassion. In other words, you're worried about Bedman's well-being. Just like Dick Nose, and his entire friend group, apparently. They literally just tried something like this too, and they all went home because it wasn't working. And they know Bedman. They're on the right side of the fourth wall and everything, so why didn't that work? The thing is that, and Dick Nose kind of hit on this in the last segment, Bedman will only change if Bedman decides to change. Or rather, people will only change if people decide to change. If Bedman decides to be miserable, there's not a lot anybody can do about it. But if Bedman decides that he wants to improve his situation somehow, he still needs to make that decision for himself. One good starting point is to practice self-compassion, taking that compassion one would feel for others and pointing it inward toward yourself. So let's say, hypothetically, Bedman really was a fraud. It wasn't the imposter syndrome talking, he really was a fraud. And he never had any friends, and his work was always awful, and his judgment really was always terrible. Even if all those things are true, that doesn't mean he deserves to feel unhappy, or feel unloved, or feel unsafe. He doesn't deserve to suffer. Even if he really was all those things, that doesn't mean his problems are innate or essential to his personality. Even if he really was a fraud, he could just decide to be truthful. If he really didn't have any friends, he could decide to go out and make some. If his judgment really was terrible, he could just learn to judge problems better. But if he spends all of his time thinking about his past, he won't have time to change his present. To forgive someone means to let go of any negative emotions you held toward them, like resentment or anger, allowing you to move past whatever came between you and get on with your life. It doesn't necessarily mean becoming best friends with whoever you're forgiving, just that you won't let whatever happened bother you going forward. For instance, if a friend apologizes for something they said behind your back, and you forgive them, you are actively deciding not to spend any more time being mad at them for talking behind your back. Similarly, self-forgiveness is the practice of letting go of any negative emotions you may have, like shame or resentment or self-hatred, towards yourself, and the active decision to move past whatever problems you may have caused yourself in the past in order to improve your life in the future. And human beings aren't perfect creatures, so we always have something to forgive ourselves for. Like, we get hungry, and we get thirsty, and we have to sleep at inopportune times, and sometimes we get sick, and sometimes we get depressed, and sometimes we misunderstand stuff, or step on other people's toes, or say dumb things on the internet. And sometimes we can do something about it, like if we're hungry we can eat, and if we're thirsty we can drink. But sometimes we just don't have perfect control over the situation. Like, what are you supposed to do if you get sick, besides go back to bed and wait it out? Even with modern technology, you can't just zap away a cold, you have to take the time to recover. The same is true for mental health problems, like depression. Even minor issues can be complex patterns of behavior that require patience to properly untangle. So, staying compassionate for yourself, and forgiving yourself, can give you that patience and help salvage some energy that you might need in order to see yourself through your recovery. Which, in Bedman's case, might not be as long as he thinks. Because fortunately for us, Bedman is not actually a fraud. So now we've worked out that we have a mental health problem, and now we've even managed to scrape together some mental energy for recovery. So the next question is, what the fuck are we recovering from? From our side of the fourth wall, we know Bedman's problem. The guy's depressed because he thinks he's worthless, because he isn't as productive as he thinks he should be, because he's working too hard. Got it, that all makes sense. But does Bedman know that? The second step to Bedman's recovery is a practice called mindfulness. Considering he's already started practicing self-compassion, he's already made a lot of headway. He already has some understanding of his situation, insofar as he recognizes that he is a human, and as a result does not have perfect control over his body or his environment. Mindfulness is, quote, a mental state achieved by focusing one's awareness on the present moment, while calmly acknowledging and accepting one's feelings, thoughts, and bodily sensations, used as a therapeutic technique. You could also think of it as a kind of self-awareness. It's basically you actively paying attention to the way that you think, so you can then use that information to make healthier decisions. Speaking of, let's review real quick our slightly informal definition of healthiness. Something is mentally healthy when it enables someone to make useful, constructive decisions that allow them to live happier lives, achieve their goals, and adapt to the world around them without hurting themselves or others. Contrast to mentally unhealthy behaviors, which are habits or dogmas or misinformations or whatever the fuck, that interrupt your ability to make those healthy decisions. In order to better understand self-awareness, let's set a scene. Let's say today is Saturday, in the middle of spring. Your schedule is clear for the whole day, nobody expects anything of you, nobody's going to intrude, and you can't think of anything to do. If it's sunny outside, you might consider, hypothetically, going for a walk. But if it's raining, you might want to consider staying inside instead. So practicing self-awareness, at least in this case, is as easy as asking yourself why you wouldn't want to take a walk in the rain. And there's no wrong answers either. You could end up saying something like, I don't like getting wet, or I don't want to get a cold, or I don't like going outside, and those are all fine. The point isn't judging your own motivations as much as it is knowing what your motivations are in the first place. So whatever your answer might be, the important thing is that you answered your own question, and now you have a better understanding of your own motivations, wants, and needs, and a better sense of self-awareness. Actually, content creators kind of have an edge here. As artists, we already have some familiarity with self-awareness. Otherwise, we would never grow as artists. We'd never notice that our line art is jank, or that our comic timing is off, or that we keep confusing THEN then with THAN then if we never developed at least some ability to examine ourselves. The trick is applying this skill to the rest of our lives. Maybe there's something to learn here. For instance, let's say you're an artist. Wait, do you have a pen and paper near you? Look around, look around. I'll wait. You don't even need like a lot of paper. Just grab like a tax form and flip it over. Draw on the margins of a book. It's okay, it's art. Okay, got it? Surprise! You're an artist now! Time to do some arts! So, let's say, as an example, we want to draw a circle, right? By the way, look at the screen now. It's not just, like, sources. Now we're gonna do art, okay? Let's say we want to draw a circle, and we end up with something more like an ellipse. And you, the artist, might say, fuck you! That's not a fucking circle, that's some kind of ellipse! So you try again, and you draw another circle. And this time it's circular, but still not quite a circle. So you try again, and you try another circle, and it's getting better, and you try again, and it's getting better still. And you do this over and over and over and over until you finally draw a fucking circle. And you say, fuck yes, I am the fucking circliest. And fucking congratulations, you just did art. That's called an art therapy, look it up! And just like improvement, self-awareness doesn't stop either. You can just keep questioning your questions over and over, and if you keep doing that for long enough, suddenly you're a fucking philosopher. Just ask Descartes, the I think therefore I am guy. That was his whole shtick. Questioning himself over and over and over and over again, systematically doubting everything he could until he found the one thing he couldn't doubt, a quote-unquote fundamental truth. And then, once he found that truth, he would expand outward again, rubbing logic and the scientific method on it in order to develop his understanding of the world. So maybe we should take a page out of Descartes' book in order to improve our own lives. But for now, maybe outright philosophy is getting ahead of ourselves. Let's get back to beating depression. Okay, let's put all of this into practice, and go back to that art circly sequential improvement thing. That was fun. So, you're depressed, and you're lying in bed, and you're staring at the ceiling because you just became an artist like 10 seconds ago, but now you've heard of this thing called self-compassion, and self-forgiveness, and self-awareness, and apparently all of these things are designed to help you beat depression, and that's good, because you're getting really tired of this whole depression shtick. Fuck me, you might say. I hate myself. But that doesn't help, you're still depressed, so you think about it more than not at all. Wait a minute. I don't hate myself, you might think. I just hate being depressed. And now you feel a little better. If I'm depressed, you might think, I should do something about it. You feel a little better. I should get out of bed and do something fun, Bedman says, leaping out of bed and directly onto a fucking skateboard. And you say, holy shit, you can just do that? Absolutely. Hi, this is Shout. I'm god-modding right now, so anything goes. If Bedman can do that, you might think, then I can do it too, you say, leaping out of bed and also onto a skateboard, instantly eating shit. Damn it! Never mind. I'm worthless, actually. I'm going back to being depressed. Ooh. A lot of things just happened there. But the important thing is that you tried. No, like, literally, the most important thing about beating depression is trying to beat depression. We've already touched a little on the idea that hope is a means of recovery, and now we can actually see its practical purpose. The worst thing you can do while you're depressed is just give in and let yourself be depressed. Even though you're suffering, you have to take some responsibility for yourself. You have to drag yourself out of bed, you have to put the food in your mouth, and you have to try to make things better for yourself, because that is the only way those little victories will be yours. Taking responsibility is basically the practice of personally fixing your own problems, instead of expecting someone else to make you feel better. This is because, in the context of mental health, the only person who can begin to know what's best for you is you. Only you can begin to understand the contents of your own mind. Only you have access to your own lived experience. Only you have access to your memories and your fears and your hopes and your dreams, because nobody else can reach into your head and pull that information out of you without your cooperation on some level, which means you have to take an active role in your own recovery. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of your problems are actually your fault. It just means that it's your responsibility to deal with them. If you're walking down the street and fall in a hole, it isn't your fault that there's a fucking human-sized hole in the fucking street. However, once you're aware that there is a hole, you could decide to not walk down Hole Street, or to cover the hole with something, or to resolve to watch where you're going so you stop falling in Team Rocket pitfalls. In contrast, to blame someone else means to indicate that not only are they responsible for causing a problem, which they very well could be, but they are also responsible for your response to the problem, which they very much are not. For instance, let's say you're walking down the street, and there's a big hole in the street, and you're some kind of awful harpy. I would do a harpy voice, but my voice only goes so high, so just picture a harpy voice. Whoever dug this hole, you might say, must be held responsible for their actions. Whatever careless, insipid, vile cretin who put this hole in my way is putting innocent lives at risk. That's as close as I can get. So the construction worker, the hole digger, the guy who dug the hole, says, "I'm sorry, we're fixing the road, but we're working as fast as we can," and you say, "Sorry isn't good enough." Is this a harpy voice? I'm trying, but I'm ending up at like James from Pokemon. Anyway, you say that thing you said, "Sorry isn't good enough," and the construction worker scratches his head, and you snort, turn up your nose, straighten your back, walk down the street, past the construction worker, past the traffic cones, past the caution tape, past the sign that says "Big hole in street, don't fall in hole, big hole, street hole, big," and immediately fall in the fucking hole. And from the bottom of the hole you say, I'm going back to my normal voice, "How dare you dig this hole? You made me fall in this hole." Which on the surface makes some kind of sense. If that hole were not there, the harpy would not have been able to fall into it. But there's one problem. The worker didn't make the harpy do anything. In fact, if anything, the worker actively tried to dissuade the harpy from falling in the hole. But the harpy blamed him anyway. The thing is, by holding someone else responsible for your own behavior, you are relinquishing what control you have to change that behavior, to make decisions that would improve your life for yourself, and forcing that responsibility onto someone else. The exact message that the harpy is sending here is that if you hadn't dug this hole, or had filled the hole faster, or had done more to prevent me from falling inside this hole, then I would not have fallen in this hole, so it's your fault that I ate shit, which is, in a sense, true. But the harpy also had the opportunity to change their mind and plenty of information to help them do so, but they made that choice to ignore that information and somehow fell in the hole anyway. If their ultimate goal really is to stop falling in holes, and this isn't some kind of elaborate insurance scam or something, then they had all the information they needed. They just didn't actually act on what the worker was trying to tell them. But this harpy hole scenario is a very simple model. In the context of mental health, there's at least one more big wrinkle. When you blame someone else for your problems, when you hold someone else responsible for causing a problem and resolving it on your behalf, even in the best case scenario, where the other actor cares about you and has your best interests at heart, the other actor only has so much information to make a useful decision for you. Even, for instance, parents don't know exactly what their kids are thinking. They can only make an educated guess based off of what information the kid is willing to share and what information the parent is able to observe. The only person who can really know everything about you is yourself, because only you can really know what it is like to be you. Only you have full access to your lived experience. Only you can feel your own feelings. Only you have access to all your moving parts. Only you can understand your intentions and motivations and why you do the things that you do. So only you can understand what is causing your problems. The rest of the world can only see what behavior makes it to the surface. They can't see the inner world underneath it, which means only you can know for sure if any action you take is genuinely making your life better. Like, let's say you're a worker, filling a hole in Hole Street, and suddenly a haggard, frazzled, miserable-looking person walks up to you and starts barking insults at you before stumbling off down the street and falling into your hole and quickly dissolving into bitter tears. You have no idea what's going on, and this person is obviously in no shape to tell you what's happening. The best you can really do is pull them out of the hole and maybe call someone and just kinda get back to work and hope that they'll be okay. You can't read their mind or anything, and you can't get any information out of them, so there's not a lot you can do. And yeah, it's actually the idea of being alone in your own mind can sound a little scary, even like a little lonely. The idea that nobody will really understand you like you understand you. But there's an upside to all this. In the same way that Bedman's company of one has no red tape or politics, nobody else has to sign off on your decision to make life better for yourself. The real trouble is working out what exactly is causing the problem in the first place and exactly what choice to make. Self-improvement usually isn't as simple as literally saying to yourself, "I'm gonna stop walking into holes." Like, if you're walking into holes as a result of some other kind of behavior, if walking into holes is just the surface behavior, then you might have to examine the next level down. And if that behavior emerges from another behavior, you might have to go deeper still. But unless some external force is coercing your behavior, these choices are yours to change. If there is something forcing you into that hole, and the situation really is out of your hands, then there's not a lot you can do. It could be environmental factors, it could be social factors, whatever, it doesn't matter. This is another instance where self-compassion and self-forgiveness come into play. Even if you did make a mistake, if the problem was out of your hands, and you did everything you could, then there's no point on dwelling on your failure, because it isn't really your fault. But, again, that doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do now, just that there was nothing you could do back then. One caveat, at least in my own personal experience, the blame game usually isn't a big problem for content creators. In fact, in particular, content creators have a tendency to take too much responsibility. Like, they'll take responsibility for things that aren't their fault, like the whims of the market, or unforeseen circumstance, or bad faith misunderstandings. In other words, blaming themselves for problems outside of their control. I think this is because content creators tend to be conditioned to look for opportunities to improve themselves, improve their output, improve their craft, whatever. Because, in a way, like I mentioned before, responsibility is part of being an artist. But when it comes to something called self-care, it is important not to take on any more problems than you can handle. If you're suffering from depression or anxiety or any other mental health problem, you can't blow it all away all at once. Any mental illness is a system of maladaptive behaviors that all require individual attention to pull apart. So, once you're aware that there is a problem, and once you're ready to take on that problem, and have an idea of what you're up against, the next step is to start taking it down one step at a time. And those steps can be a lot smaller than you might think. Self-care is any activity we do deliberately in order to take care of our mental, emotional, and physical health. This can include anything from eating better, to sleeping better, to forcing yourself to talk to friends, or even deliberately setting aside your responsibilities and doing nothing on purpose to allow yourself to relax. And the first couple steps are always the hardest. Remember, you're up against depression, so you're going to be up against warped judgment, and exhaustion, and self-hatred, and worse. But with every step, the struggle will get easier. Not because there's just literally less depression to deal with, but because every little bit of energy you reclaim from maladaptive behavior is more energy you can use to correct that maladaptive behavior. It's a little like gaining momentum. First you struggle, then you walk, and then you begin to run. And at this point in your recovery, friends can finally come in handy. They still can't reach into your head and make you feel better, that's still something you have to do for yourself, but they can be there to listen to your problems, or be a shoulder to cry on, or be an excuse to skip work and play Melee with the boys all day. Sometimes they don't even have to do anything, just knowing that there are people out there who care about you can give you a reason to care about yourself. In some ways, just having someone on the other side can make the journey worth taking. But you don't have to rush yourself. If your problem is overwork, then rushing is the last thing you should be doing. So, between self-compassion, self-forgiveness, self-awareness, and ultimately self-care, we now have all the tools we need to begin to understand and even deal with maladaptive psychological systems such as stress, anxiety, burnout, and depression. We also know better than to rush our recovery. We'll know when we get there and not a second before. Until then, let's take it easy. You've earned a break, don't you think? Now, there is one caveat, and really as far as caveats go, this one isn't so bad. Just because someone has beaten stress, or anxiety, or burnout, or depression, doesn't mean whatever environmental pressure caused the stress in the first place has just gone away. In the same way that if you were to recover from broken legitis, and in fact your leg grows back even stronger than ever before, when you get out of the hospital bed, you still have to stand on your legs and expose them to environmental pressure again. And that's before going back to your job at the broken leg factory. Now, as content creators, we do have a little more power to affect our environment. We can at least take a break without getting fired, but even that comes with a pretty big but. But we're still subject to, for instance, systemic issues. Like, just because someone is their own boss doesn't mean they get to personally walk up to the CEO of capitalism to give the guy a big wedgie by themselves. So, for the most part, we just kinda have to deal. For instance, Bedman is not just going to spend the rest of his life on a skateboard. Once he's ready, he'll have to go back to his job, which means dealing with his workload, which means dealing with social media, which means dealing with expectations again. Hell, even outside of the workplace, he'll have to get back in touch with all of his friends again, which could be pretty awkward after the whole after-school special thing. In fact, Dick Nose hasn't heard from the guy in a couple months either. He knows that Bedman still exists. Like, every once in a while, someone will spot him around town kissing rails or collecting VHS tapes or pretending that he's a Superman, so he's not too worried. He's gotten over the difficult part after all. He's out of bed, he's doing stuff, he's living life again, so Bedman can handle the rest himself. In this case, no news is good news. So Dick Nose's daily life as a construction worker continues in peace. Maybe today he'll even get the chance to fill in the hole in Hole Street. Then it'll just be streets! Then, one day, out of nowhere, Bedman calls up Dicknose and asks if he'd like to go get some lunch, and Dicknose accepts without a second thought. They decide to go visit their old stomping grounds, a greasy spoon in the poor part of town, and order a bunch of bullshit like a $5 bucket of fries, which would suggest that Bedtown is somewhere in America, and the two friends make some polite conversation for a little while before Bedman begins to open up. And he says that he's still a little worried, this time about returning to work. Fortunately, his fan base is still there. Nobody draws hand-animated Western Gajinka grunty from Banjo-Kazooie non-pornography like Bedman, after all. And while there were some people who were pretty upset, most of his followers were actually downright supportive. People in general have a better understanding of mental health now, so they can feel for what Bedman has been going through. That doesn't mean it hasn't been hard work playing catch-up, though, and Bedman had been back at the grindstone for a little while before he got back in contact with one of their mutual friends, who told him all about some kind of elaborate surprise party after-school special plan? Dicknose laughs, and he explains, yeah, he got like 30 of their friends together to try to cheer Bedman up, and Bedman just kinda ollied out of his bedroom window and everyone figured that their job was done. And that's the thing, Bedman was worried he'd say that, because he never got to say thank you. And Dicknose doesn't mind, of course. He's just happy that Bedman's okay. So as long as Bedman is happy, then he's happy. And Bedman doesn't quite understand. What's worse, Dicknose can't really explain himself either. Sure, he was a little hurt in the moment, but now he understands what Bedman was going through, so it's not like he took it personally. Regardless, Bedman asks if there's anything Dicknose wants him to do in return, and Dicknose says, no, not really. It's not like Bedman knows him or anything, he really is just happy that his friend is okay. So the two friends keep talking for what could be hours on end. Sometimes about Bedman, sometimes about Dicknose, sometimes about nothing in particular, until it finally becomes time to go their separate ways. But that night, Bedman lies awake, playing back what Dicknose said in his head over and over again, still trying to parse what he was trying to say. He thinks he's been a terrible friend to Dicknose. Because of his work, he hasn't spoken to the guy in months, if not years. Plus, all the contact they've had recently has been tainted by Bedman's poor mental health, and there were times where it seemed like he was actively ignoring him. As a result, the past couple of weeks have been nothing but a waste of Dicknose's time. If he didn't have anything to gain from their relationship, if Bedman can't do anything for him, then what the fuck is the point of their friendship? Why is Dicknose still his friend? Back at the Dicknose residence, Dicknose is preparing for bed himself. His loyal dachshund, Dognose, hops up onto the mattress and does a little donut on the comforter. On his bookshelf, between a picture of his girlfriend and a picture of his parents, is a picture of Dicknose and Bedman, age 5. Before he goes to bed, Dicknose tells Dognose all about his pal Bedman and how he's so proud about how far he's come. He tells Dognose all sorts of stories, like how once upon a time he and Bedman were just dumb idiot kids, and how Dicknose was the natural artist, and how Bedman was more into numbers, and how once upon a time Bedman wanted to be a rocket scientist until life led him into animation. And how once upon a time when he was first starting out, Bedman couldn't draw his way out of a fucking paper bag, but now so many years later he's single-handedly pioneered a genre of hand-animated Western Gajinka grunty from Banjo-Kazooie non-pornography. And Dicknose just goes on and on and on, thinking of all the things that Bedman has been, and wondering what amazing thing he'll do next. Eventually the guy tires himself out, so Dicknose turns off the lights, and snuggles under the covers, and starts to dream about getting to drive the backhoe tomorrow. Dognose takes a shit on the bed. There are plenty of benefits to good mental health. For now, let's start straightforward. Once you have an understanding of yourself, you can start to understand the world around you. Maybe Bedman doesn't understand what's going on in Dicknose's head right now, but that doesn't mean he'll never understand. And now that he's dealt with his psychological problems, now that there's nothing clouding his judgment, or sapping his energy, or tricking him into self-doubt, he's free to make that decision for himself. And maybe, and this is up to him, he'll reach out and rekindle that friendship. And maybe he'll learn something new. Okay, that's probably about it for segment 1. Probably the longest part, and for a good reason. Gotta set a good foundation for the real shit after all, and yeah! There's something more real than stress, anxiety, and depression. So real quick, here are some notes before we move into segment 2. Before we continue, I'd like to reassert my credentials. I have none. I am not an expert. I'm just some shitlord. All the advice in this video is coming from what research I've done into psychology and mental health since it became such a big part of my life about a year ago now, combined with my own stories of lived experience and advice I've received from my own therapist. However, that does not mean that this information is useless. If you do identify with any of these problems, I would like you to treat this video not so much as a roadmap to recovery, but more like a more like a starting point for your own research. Even if I did have a degree in the field, I would not be able to give you counseling that you would need to improve your life specifically, because this is a fucking one-way screen. Not only can I not see you on the other side of the fourth wall, but even if I couldn't reach into your head and physically yank the depression out of you. In fact, we talked about that a couple chapters ago. But included in either the description or the comments section are a variety of links to all sorts of research material. So like videos and articles and all sorts of stuff. That might seem a little lazy, but dropping a pile of books on your desk and telling you now go is actually a lot more healthy than you'd think. The mark of a healthy relationship, even in a non-relationship like what's going on right now, involves both parties taking an interest in each other's growth and well-being without caring about personal gain. Healthy relationships, like Dicknos and Bedmans, are empowering, not controlling. In other words, a good friend wouldn't force you to make a healthy decision that they've already made for you, but rather provide you with the information, support, and patience you need to judge a healthy decision for yourself. And, as a result, good friendships are healthy in two ways. Not only are they better for both parties involved, and they're constructive in a mental healthy kind of way, but they'll also last longer than a more controlling friendship as well. That is, if you could call a controlling friendship in the first place. And when it comes to mental health, good relationships can be priceless. You might not be able to help anyone directly in a mental health situation. You might not be able to fix anyone. But if someone you cares about is suffering from some kind of mental illness, remember that there are a lot of little things that you can do. You can talk to them, you can check on them, you can buy them food. And remember, you can't expect results. There's nothing you can do to somebody that'll just make them feel better. Remember that this is a journey that they're taking for themselves. But, at the same time, there's no better way to remind someone that they're human than someone else treating them like a human being. And again, from the outside looking in, you might never know how your actions impact someone suffering anxiety or depression or all of the above. And again, to someone suffering mental illness, knowing that there's something on the other end of the tunnel, knowing that there are friends to return to, that there's a life to return to, can make that journey worth taking. And if all else fails, a good friend, not me, remember, I don't know you, I'm just a voice on the internet, I can't see past this gif, can help you find professional help, like a therapist or a counselor. If you ever get stuck, or hell, even if you aren't stuck but you want a professional opinion anyway, try giving therapy a shot. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is a non-invasive and highly effective form of therapy that basically boils down to a therapist listening to what you have to say, helping you to recognize whatever problems you may or may not be dealing with, and supporting you by teaching you techniques and information to help you deal with your problem yourself. Not only does CBT work on all sorts of psychological problems, because most of these problems have their root in some kind of maladaptive behavior, but if CBT doesn't work, your therapist can help point you in the direction of something that will. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Now it's time for the real shit. Let's talk about therapy later. So in the previous segment, we've covered stress, anxiety, burnout, depression, and we talked in brief about self-care, and even how to care for others. We even have some understanding of mental health jargon. Like, now we know what a maladaptive behavior is and how it can form, and how self-perpetuating behaviors such as long-term depression could be classified as a disorder. We also have a slightly cheaty understanding of what constitutes a healthy behavior. So now that we've got a better understanding of that cheaty understanding of mental health, let's review one of the definitions that we found at the beginning of segment 1. Quote the U.S. Department of Health and Services, "Mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, from childhood to adolescence to adulthood." Hey, is it me, or are Americans on the front line of all this mental health bullshit? Anyway, let's focus for a second on the idea that mental health affects how we make choices. We've learned that depression can seriously hamper your judgment, for instance, so that line checks out. Anxiety, too, can cause you to make decisions in the moment that you would otherwise avoid. But so far, we've only really been treating these two problems as symptoms, like something bothering us, and clues to better treatment. Like, our goal so far has just been to push past those problems so we can get back to living our lives. But if bad mental health can mess with our judgment, and poor judgment can lead to mental illness, then maybe we should treat good mental health as not just the absence of any problems, but the first line of defense against mental illness. Almost like how in physical health, a healthy immune system can prevent you from catching a cold even if you get caught in the rain. In that case, self-care could be seen as almost a form of preventative medication. Like if you get depressed, and then you beat depression, you'll know what you're messing with if you ever get depressed again. And it'll be that much easier for you to beat it. Kinda like gaining immunity. The only difference is that with the immune system, the process is autonomic. Hey, remember that word? But with mental illness, either consciously or unconsciously, your mind is doing all the work. Also, like a cold, we know that we can become mentally ill from environmental factors. Remember, stress can be caused by all sorts of pressure, like physical conditions, or workplace conditions, or relationship conditions. Although it isn't exactly like catching a cold. Because while mental health can be affected by the outside world and vice versa, mental constructs like a maladaptive behavior can't perpetuate itself without a mind to perpetuate within. In other words, you can't catch depression by licking a depressed keyboard. It isn't like a physical germ, it's a psychological thing. But we also know that positive relationships with other individuals, like for instance healthy friendships, can affect your mental health, and those relationships do entail contact with individuals with minds of their own. So, if you come in contact with someone carrying some kind of mental illness, maybe the mechanics aren't exactly the same, but is it possible that you can catch mental illness from someone else? In this segment, we'll talk about the ways that interpersonal relationships, in particular abusive relationships, can affect your mental health. And a quick warning, from this point on, the subject matter will get darker as we get closer and closer to my own personal experience. I'll try to keep things lighthearted when I can, and I promise this video does have a happy ending, but if things become overwhelming, again, feel free to pause the video, take a break, or even close the tab and come back later. Okay, still here? Apparently telling people to close the video is a terrible idea. The algorithm hates that, so I'm glad you stuck around. Quote, emotional abuse, sometimes called psychological abuse, is an attempt to control in just the same way that physical abuse is an attempt to control another person. The only difference is that the emotional abuser does not use physical hitting, kicking, pinching, grabbing, pushing, or any other kind of physical form of harm. Rather, the perpetrator of emotional abuse uses emotion as their weapon of choice. We've touched on how controlling behaviors aren't healthy, that the human mind can't make decisions for another person because they aren't privy to all the memories and emotions and experience inside their own head that they would use to make their own decisions. A system sometimes called euphemistically as their inner world. However, this is mostly a practical take. It's almost like saying you can't drive a car from the back seat because you can't see out the windshield and therefore it is ineffective. And all of that is true. What we haven't touched on are the more insidious effects that this control can have on someone's inner world. What happens to someone psychologically when they are controlled by someone else? In other words, what it's like for the driver when someone in the back seat reaches over their shoulders and takes the wheel. When one person is forced to act under another person's control, they are forced to relinquish what little ability they have to affect the world, but the actions that they take while underneath that person's control still affect them, the actor, but not necessarily the controller. This kind of relationship, an abusive relationship, can have profound psychological and emotional effects on the abusee, or target of abuse, the person being controlled. But the abuser, the controller, the person forcing them to perform that action, does not suffer the same consequences, especially an emotional abuser who doesn't have to be in the car at all, and in fact might like it that way, because if they can get you to drive off a cliff, they won't hit the ground. But you will. We're already partway into this segment, but in order to further explore psychological abuse, we're about to get into some rather fraught but utterly fictional examples of abuse. It'll get better in the next segment, but if that sounds like too much for you, here's a skip timestamp. Don't worry, no shame, I've got my hand on the fucking stove here too, and I'm hosting this fucking video. Like if I thought I could, I'd skip it too! Fuck! So, let's go back to the Hull Street scenario. Let's say you're walking down Hull Street, and there's a big hole in the street, but this time you're being held at gunpoint. All of a sudden, while on the way home from work, someone got behind you and pressed a gun to your back, and threatened to shoot you if you don't continue walking straight down the street. You are forced to obey, walking slowly down the long winding street, careful not to make any sudden moves. There aren't any street lights, it's too dark to see where you're going, it's too late for anyone to be on the road, much less a side road like this. You don't know where you're going, you don't know what they want, and you don't know what you're going to do, until suddenly you stop. And the person behind you snarls, "What's the problem?" And you say, "This is Hull Street, there's a hole in the street!" Then suddenly you feel the person behind you jab your back with the gun, commanding you to walk forward anyway. And as a result, you fall face first right down into the hole. Then all of a sudden you hear him laughing as something clatters to earth beside you. A hollow metal pipe. The ersatz gun you are being threatened with. Which means you are never in any danger. In this scenario, the threat of physical force, in the form of bodily harm, is used as a means of coercion, but the actual motivation for the person walking down Hull Street isn't that they're actively avoiding harm per se, but because they're fearing for their lives. They aren't running from live fire to avoid getting shot, they are trying to convince the quote-unquote shooter to not shoot at all for fear of getting shot. This means that even the threat of physical violence here has a psychological, emotional element to it. The protagonist's fear of getting shot is his motivation, and the abuser is using the threat of physical force as a means of delivery. This pattern of threatening physical violence but not actually performing physical violence is a very common pattern of domestic abuse. In some ways, it's just a practicality. If an abusive spouse beats their partner all day, they'll begin to get bruises and get cuts and visible damage that could tip someone off to their violence. It also means that they can wield more power over a target with less actual effort. If an abusive father raises his hand to beat his child, then the child may flinch and begin to obey his orders without the father having to get off his ass to do the dirty work. In this way, even the threat of physical violence is, in a sense, psychologically violent. Now, let's flip the script. You're back at the top of Hull Street, and you're being forced to walk down the street at gunpoint. However, this time, you can clearly see the person with a gun. It really is holding a gun this time. But this time, if you don't walk down the street with them, they are threatening to kill themselves. And they say, it will be your fault. Here, there is no personal physical danger, so the threat is purely emotional. This particular tactic, emotional blackmail, revolves around the idea that if you do not comply with the aggressor's demands, they will do something to hurt themselves as a result of your action or inaction. What the abuser is counting on here is that their target accepts that responsibility, and that fear, and that stress, and everything else that comes along with it. And not just for this one event, if they can help it. If the abuser can get their target to accept responsibility and respond to all of their actions, then the abuser can control their target through what is called psychological manipulation. But it's easy to see what's happening here from a more objective perspective, like in retrospect, or from a third party, or from behind the safety of a fourth wall. But human experience doesn't have an objective perspective. There's no host telling you what is really happening. You have to work with what information you have. And if you're right there, with your boots on the ground, with your heart beating out of your chest, with someone screaming demands into your ear, claiming to know what is happening, telling you what to think, telling you how to act, and demanding that you comply with what looks like someone's life on the line, you might not find yourself thinking so clearly. And that is exactly what they want. What's really scary is that, strictly speaking, anyone can become a target of abuse. It's an environmental factor that acts upon someone, not a personal factor that comes from within. So if somebody starts to abuse you, then you just kind of have to deal with it. Which of course doesn't mean just literally lie down and die. I'm saying you have to deal with it. You have to do something about it. And as a result, there are certain personality traits that can make someone an especially attractive target of abuse. Typically pro-social positive traits. Kindness, empathy, trust, loyalty, forgiveness, agreeability, openness, honesty, an ability to see past someone's flaws and see the good in people, a willingness to be vulnerable, a willingness to please, a willingness to change and evolve. And all of that sounds cliche, and there's a reason for that. In a non-abusive relationship, these quote-unquote pro-social traits would help bring people closer together, but in an abusive relationship, these traits just make a target predictable and easier to manage. For instance, loyalty, forgiveness, and agreeability could help two friends in a positive relationship deal with their problems and reconcile their friendship. But in an abusive relationship could be leveraged by an abuser to overlook or even justify their abuse. For instance, if they can talk their target into agreeing that they deserve to be abused. Similarly, openness and honesty could give an abuser weapons against an abusee in the form of words to twist or false evidence of wrongdoing. A willingness to change could allow an abuser to mold someone's personality to suit their needs. And a willingness to evolve might convince their target to let them, if the abuser can convince them that being molded is the right thing to do. This pattern of contempt is a hallmark of abusive relationships, because unlike a healthy relationship, an abuser isn't really interested in who you are as a person, or what you're going through, as much as they are interested in what you can do for them. However, abusers aren't looking for easy targets either. They can't get anything out of someone who's depressed or anxious or stressed out all the time. But they still need some kind of hook. Ideally, an abusee would be someone who is just unhealthy enough to have some kind of psychological issue that the abuser can get involved in, something they can grab onto to sneak their way into their target's life, but not have so many issues that their quote-unquote upkeep outweighs their return on investment. In fact, their ideal target is a lot more like the ideal tool or machine than any kind of person. Someone who's durable, faithful, always effective, someone who will never question their behavior, and someone with plenty of places to grab onto. It actually might be worth putting a pin in the idea of an abuser's return on investment, by the way. We'll be getting back to that in a second. An individual with what is called an intimate relationship with an abuser is also especially vulnerable. Both romantic relationships, like their significant others, or platonic relationships, like family members and close friends. Even when armed with the knowledge that an abuser is dangerous for their mental and possibly physical health, An intimate individual could decide to stay with their abuser in a misguided attempt to help them, instead of leaving to protect themselves, or worse, they could return to an abuser they have already escaped out of nostalgia for better times. But if the abuser hasn't changed, then all this prosocial behavior really accomplishes is to expose the target to further abuse and maintain the status quo. If an abuser wants to abuse you, then the abuser doesn't even really care why you're there, as long as they get what they want. However, no matter what personality they may have, no matter what traits they may have, no matter what behaviors they may exhibit, it is never the target of abuse's fault that they became a target of abuse. While it is true that there are factors that contribute to abuse, even factors that might lie within the target's control, nobody causes their abuse through any fault of their own. Nobody decides to be abused. Someone else has to decide to abuse them. In fact, holding an abuse survivor responsible for their abuser's decision to abuse them by saying they should have been more careful, or that they shouldn't have had some kind of character trait, or they should have done something to avoid their abuse, or even that they should have known better, is called blaming the victim, and only serves to protect the abuser, something that abusers are perfectly good at doing for themselves. However, just like how anyone can become a target of abuse, anyone can potentially be an abuser, not just any sex, race, or whatever, but literally any human being. This is because abuse is a maladaptive behavior, not just a symptom of some deeper problem. Again, it ain't like someone just goes insane and starts being abusive because they've lost the capacity for reason and the Cthulhus are leaking out of their brain, nor is it like how people just start sneezing after they catch a cold. In a sense, as a behavior, being abusive is a choice, something someone decides to do based on the information that they have at hand. That said, it isn't like abusers are literally just choosing to be abusive either. It's not like abusers are arbitrarily picking the bad option whenever they're faced with some kind of objective binary moral choice. Like, down on the D-pad is just abuse in big green all caps. But they're choosing to perform some action that results in abuse. In fact, from their perspective, an abuser may or may not think what they're doing is wrong to anyone at all. Again, abuse is a behavior, and like a lot of maladaptive behaviors, what they may be doing might have been useful in one circumstance, but is hurting them and others in another. When it comes to profiling them, however, abusers tend to be insecure, needy with unrealistic expectations of a relationship, distrustful, often jealous, verbally abusive, needs to be right and in control. They might be possessive and may try to isolate their partner from friends and family. They might be hypersensitive and react aggressively. They may have a history of aggression. They may be cruel to animals or children. They may blame their behavior on others. And they may suffer from untreated mental health problems, including depression or suicidal behavior. Abuse also tends to be a pattern of behavior. It usually isn't a one-off thing, like someone is insecure for a little while and then they apologize and it never comes up again. And even if an abuser stops abusing one person, they'll probably go on to abuse someone else if they haven't actually stopped being abusive. This is because, as we've touched on before, people will not change if they don't decide to take responsibility for themselves. In other words, people will not change if they do not decide to change. And abusers, categorically, do not see their behavior as the problem. This might come as a surprise to you, but this is about as far as a lot of people, well, YouTube commenters on psych videos, but a lot of people get before they tap out and just decide that they know all there is to know about the subject, that abuse is a choice, and anyone can be an abuser, and abusers are gonna abuse. And with this, half understanding, abusers can sound almost monstrous and less like human beings. Like abusers are some kind of devil in human skin, or like truly bad people, or they're broken, or spiteful, or evil. But these behaviors don't just come out of nowhere. Abuse is a behavior, which means that it has to come from something. Abuse can be, for instance, an adaptation to an environment. Let's say, for instance, someone grew up in an abusive household, and their worldview believes that the world only consists of winners and losers. And under this paradigm, in order to avoid becoming a loser, you might think you have to become a winner, which could entail treating everyone around you as a means to an end. In other words, abusing them. However, this behavior might not indicate a discrete disorder, as much as it does a kind of bad information. Information that doesn't help you understand yourself, or anyone around you, or reality any better. In fact, in this case, it's actively making life worse. However, about half of all abusers do tend to have some kind of untreated psychological disorder. Major depressive disorder, antisocial personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, the list goes on. But finally, we're getting to some good news. 1 in 25 US citizens in 2018 dealt with some kind of diagnosable mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder, and about 40% of those folks got treatment. So, the majority of people with what is called a pathology, that is to say, the traits that make up a disease, don't become abusive. But the people who do have a pathology and do become abusive tend to be very predictable. Because unlike non-pathological abusers, who are abusive for something like environmental reasons, like misinformation or whatever the fuck, which can vary wildly from person to person and might be more the realm of like sociology or politics or something, the psych world has dealing with pathological abusers down to a literal science, making it that much easier for us to understand them. Just to dip our toes into the world of pathological abusers, let's talk about two of the quote-unquote cluster B personality disorders, otherwise known as the dramatic personality disorders, where cluster A disorders tend to revolve around disordered thinking, think like paranoid personality disorder, and cluster C disorders tend to revolve around anxiety, think anxiety disorders, also OCD, I guess. Cluster B disorders tend to revolve around emotional dysregulation, for instance, anger management problems, which can lead to, among other things, problems in interpersonal relationships. In other words, if someone with a disorder is going to abuse you, that disorder will probably be a disorder from cluster B. The first disorder we're going to talk about is the infamous narcissistic personality disorder, which, quote, involves a distorted self-image, emotions that can be unstable and intense, and an excessive concern with vanity, prestige, power, and personal adequacy. There also tends to be a lack of empathy and an exaggerated sense of superiority. Narcissism, although I would never admit it, revolves around a deep sense of shame and inadequacy, which often result from some form of abuse. However, in order to avoid engaging with this shame or inadequacy, someone suffering NPD would create a false self, a character that they could embody and that they then use to cover that wound. However, in order to legitimize this false self, they abuse and humiliate the people around them in order to prove their power, validate themselves, and perpetuate their own disorder. But this validation doesn't last forever. The false self they create is very fragile and falters under any criticism, and requires constant upkeep in the form of a constant stream of quote-unquote narcissistic supply to keep from having to engage with their true self, and thus the abuse continues. As a result of this delusion and self-loathing, narcissists are not usually self-aware. They aren't unintelligent or anything necessarily. If they weren't smart enough to abuse people, we wouldn't have a problem. So they'll pick up, for instance, new ways to manipulate people into getting them to do what they want, and are also perceptive enough to recognize that people are catching on. But, as a quirk of their own refusal to self-reflect, someone with NPD might not even know their own weaknesses, and in order to protect the image of their false self, probably wouldn't even admit to being flawed if they did. In fact, most narcissists are not aware that they're even narcissists, nor would they ever tell you. Now, the second disorder we'll talk about is called borderline personality disorder, quote, a condition characterized by difficulties regulating emotion. This means that people who experience BPD feel emotions intensely and for extended periods of time, and it is harder for them to return to a stable baseline after an emotionally triggering event. Borderline also has self-image problems and can also stem from a history of abuse, but that's about where the parallels to narcissism end. Where narcissism as a disorder is terrified of honest self-reflection, borderline wouldn't even know what it's fucking looking at. Someone with BPD could have a very unstable inner self, or even have no sense of self at all, and as a result be constantly struggling to define themselves and develop a sense of self-esteem in what appears to be an extremely hostile environment. See, BPD also tends to involve a very deep-seated fear of abandonment, and a very high rate of comorbidity, which is just a really threatening-sounding word for when one disorder tends to come with another disorder. For instance, borderline has a 96% chance comorbidity rate with other mood disorders, like depression, and an 88% chance comorbidity rate with anxiety disorders, like anxiety. I already made this joke. Other behaviors that are common with BPD include something called splitting, which is a kind of defense mechanism involving extreme black and white thinking, where someone suffering BPD exclusively sees people as all good and thus incapable of doing wrong, or all bad and thus exclusively and unilaterally hostile and dangerous. Splitting can even take place retroactively. If a target who someone with BPD had previously viewed as non-threatening makes some kind of mistake, or even a perceived mistake, they could paint them black and reinterpret benign actions that they had taken in the past as some kind of subterfuge or deception. And, because of this particular cocktail of behaviors, the lens through which someone with borderline sees the world can not just be warped, but terrifying. They are constantly looking for threats, even in the people closest to them. But, because of their anxiety, their black and white thinking, and because of their emotional bias, everything is either not a problem at all, or only wants to hurt them, and always wanted to hurt them. In some cases, as is the case with quote-unquote quiet borderline personality disorder, you, quote, act in. You experience the entire gamut of emotions: fear of rejection, mood swings, rage, obsessive emotional attachment, self-doubt, anxiety, all that. However, you do not show that inner turmoil on the outside. Instead of lashing out, you direct that anger, hate, and blame toward yourself. In other cases, these emotions flow outward, in the form of quote-unquote anger outbursts, irrational accusations of others, and self-destructive impulsive behavior, and can even escalate into targeted abuse as the person with BPD begins to blame their problems on whoever their disorder has painted black today. Like narcissistic abuse, the function of this borderline abuse is to benefit the abuser at the cost of the abusee, if somewhat less directly. By blaming someone else for their problems and then attacking that someone else, the person suffering BPD can get a brief reprieve from their terrifying existence by feeling like they've destroyed a monster, when all they've really done is scapegoated someone else for their own problems, and may have even burned bridges with a healthy relationship. Although, a quick aside and a quick reminder, not everyone with a disorder will become an abuser. Just like how there's quiet BPD, there's also quote-unquote benign narcissism. But, for the sake of argument, in this segment we are going to be talking exclusively about abusive individuals suffering from either NPD or BPD. As we can see, both NPD and BPD can have problems interpreting others, whereas people with NPD can be said to have little to no empathy, for instance, seeing people as goals to strive to, peons beneath them, or sources of supply that have already been conquered, but not as full-blown people with inner worlds. People with BPD tend to have very high empathy, but when they lose sight of an actual person, they can be so intent on spotting threats before they happen that they stop empathizing with a real person and start to empathize with a character instead. And as a result of these misinterpretations of reality, these cognitive distortions, both people with NPD and people with BPD can have patterns of idealizing, devaluing, and discarding their relationships, a pattern that can, by confusing and distressing their targets, serve to mask their abuse, or even perpetuate further abuse. In narcissism, the cycle could look something like this. First, the narcissist idealizes an attractive target, pulling them into a relationship and thereby securing a new source of quote-unquote narcissistic supply by treating the target with over-the-top idolization and adoration. Second, the narcissist devalues the target, subtly undermining them in order to elevate themselves above them at the expense of the target's self-esteem and well-being. Simultaneously, the narcissist hides their own behavior and blames their target for their condition. Finally, the narcissist discards their target subtly and potentially violently, leaving them traumatized and denying them any useful closure. They do this once they either lose interest in their battered target, their target begins to resist control, or their target otherwise fails to provide supply. While this can be a one-way trip, where the abuser simply moves on to a new target and the abusee just has to deal with having been abused by someone they trusted, the abuser could restart the cycle by quote-unquote hoovering the target back into reach, with, for instance, promises that they're willing to change, or that things are different now, or that they'll give them one more chance as if it were the target that caused the problem in the first place. If the target takes the bait, which is especially common with closer relationships, as we've discussed before, the relationship will start all over again, despite, or possibly as a result of, the harm that the abuser has done to their target, through what is called psychological manipulation, the, quote, exercise of undue influence through mental distortion and emotional exploitation, with the intention to seize power, control, benefits, and privileges at the victim's expense. Every part of the narcissistic idealization, devaluation, discard pattern is engineered to control their victim without giving away what is actually going on, almost like a confidence trick or a mind game. The pattern functions to, first, get them into a bad idea of a relationship, second, to stop them from leaving that relationship, and finally to wash their hands of any responsibility for their own behavior and potentially prime their target for another round of abuse in the future. But it is key to their narcissistic abuse that the victim never realizes that they are being controlled, so the abuser must use more manipulative tactics in order to keep them in their clutches. These tactics can include stonewalling, where an abuser refuses to talk to their target at all, also known as the silent treatment; gaslighting, where the abuser attempts to get the abusee to question their perception of reality by deliberately confusing them or providing false information, providing the abuser a vacuum to convince them that their own version of reality is true; love bombing, where an abuser uses an over-the-top display of affection or adoration to trick their target into thinking that the abuser cares for them. This is also a tactic very common in high control groups, like for instance cults. Guilt tripping, where an abuser tries to induce guilty feelings in a target in an effort to control their behavior, for instance by saying something like, "You embarrassed me at a party 5 years ago, and I don't think that you're sorry. If you really cared about my feelings, you would prove it by falling inside this hole." Another tactic is isolation, where an abuser separates a target from friends and family, causing the target to rely on their abuser for quote-unquote support, giving the abuser greater control over both the abusee and the abusee's image to their cut-off friends and family. Playing the victim, where an abuser presents themselves as a victim of the abusee instead of vice versa, by twisting words or presenting only parts of the story that paint their target as the problem. Triangulation, where an abuser does not communicate with their target directly and instead uses a third party as a medium and vector of abuse, manipulating both the target to resent the medium, not the abuser calling the shots, and drafting their medium into their side of the conflict by engineering a situation where their target appears irrational but the abuser does not. And finally, the smear campaign, where an abuser actively spreads rumors to anyone who will listen to discredit the target and lionize themselves in order to gain sympathy with onlookers and align them against their target. And, of course, this tactic can coincide with any of the other previously mentioned tactics. An abuser can play the victim, smear their target, and guilt-trip their target with false allegations, all in one quote-unquote move. In the context of narcissistic abuse, these manipulations are fairly transparent. At least if you know what you're looking for, you can tell they are, for lack of a better term, malicious. But BPD also has an idealization, devaluation, discard cycle for very different reasons. Where NPD can be actively manipulating a target, BPD is more like overactively protecting the abuser. Here's an example of the idealization, devaluation, discard cycle in BPD. First, the idealization of an attractive target, who the abuser thinks can do no wrong, with whom the abuser enters into a relationship because they think they finally found the one who will never hurt them. Then, the devaluation of the target when they inevitably fall from grace by making some sort of mistake that the abuser perceives as evil, causing the abuser to flip their opinion of their target, while simultaneously recontextualizing the target's innocent attempts to defend themselves as deception or even manipulation. And finally, the discard, where the abuser attempts to defend themselves by suddenly and potentially violently ending the relationship, or even going after their target to make sure they can never hurt anyone else again, or even to hurt them first before the target can retaliate, even if the target does not actually want to retaliate. This pattern, like narcissistic abuse, can also loop. In the literature, as in literally there's a book, this cycle is nicknamed, "I hate you, don't leave me." But even that isn't quite so malicious. It isn't like the person with borderline is engineering a rescue scenario for more supply down the line, like an NPD, as much as they are surfacing from their behaviors just long enough to try to reconcile their relationship, allowing the cycle to start again. The line between intentional manipulation and genuine, if inaccurate, terror is much blurrier, especially considering that BPD can, for completely different reasons, also exhibit what we would consider as manipulative tactics. For instance, let's say that sometime into an intimate relationship, after some kind of falling out, an abuser with untreated BPD convinces their abusee that their abusee has been lying to them about their true intentions the whole relationship, and secretly only wanted to hurt them. And their abusee, under duress, believes them. If the abuser knew that this allegation was false, then we could easily call this a form of gaslighting. The abuser convinced the abusee to question their own sanity by literally accusing them of being insane. However, in this case, the abuser actually believes that their allegation is completely true. They aren't lying per se, it's definitely an emotional truth, that's what they believe the truth is to them, but that doesn't mean that they're correct. And either way, the end result is still the same. The abuser has convinced their abusee to stop trusting their own senses and replaced the resulting vacuum with their own version of reality. Actually, maybe BPD can give us a lens into why abusers don't think that they have to change, because they sincerely believe that everyone else is the problem, and they're the ones who are rational. In fact, they may not even be ill-intentioned. If a manipulative abuser goes around with a fabricated smear campaign about their abusee explicitly to hurt their target, they're clearly acting in their own self-interest. But if an abuser genuinely tries to warn people about their abusee because they think their abusee is genuinely threatening them, they might genuinely think that they're protecting others by neutralizing a problem. In fact, their own perceived abuser, without realizing that their perception is what is causing the problem. And from the outside looking in, if you didn't know what was going on, this pattern could prove very convincing. An abuser can argue with such conviction and have a crowd of people vouching for them, and even so-called false evidence can hold some kernel of truth. But, as we've learned, things aren't always so straightforward. In a way, you could call this another trick. When someone allows someone else to continue a pattern of self-destructive behavior, we call that person an enabler. This can be as straightforward as letting an alcoholic drink, or a chain smoker smoke, or as complicated as validating and helping to perpetuate another person's mental health problem. Like abusers, enablers don't usually know that they're part of the problem. In fact, they could think that they're doing the right thing, helping to protect someone, their enabled person, especially if they've been brought into the fray through some kind of emotional manipulation. Similarly, enablers are not necessarily propelled by some sort of disorder themselves. In fact, they have a lot of similarities in character to targets of abuse. The same pro-social naivete, trust, kindness, among other things, that could lead to an abuser getting their hands on a target could also lead to an enabler taking pity on and siding with an abuser, and inadvertently helping to perpetuate their problem. Quote, "The one thing that all enablers have in common is this. They love someone who is out of control, and they find themselves taking more responsibility for the actions of that person than the person is taking for themselves." To an abusee, enablers can function both to perpetuate their abuser's behavior by believing in and thus legitimizing their actions, but also as vectors of abuse themselves by harassing a target on their abuser's behalf. These vectors of abuse are also called flying monkeys. I'm so sorry about this terminology. I don't make the rules. If you want, you can call them agents, but the literature won't agree with you. Or me. In this sense, we can think of enablers as abusers as well. And remember, it doesn't really matter whether or not the person talking intends to hurt anyone, or thinks that they're doing the right thing, or is even just misinformed. Abuse is abuse is abuse. However, simultaneously, an enabler is not immune to the abuser's effects. They can quickly become an abuser's next target should their previous target somehow escape their abuse, just by virtue of proximity, in the same way that close friends and family members are also targets of abuse as well. For instance, an enabler of narcissistic abuse can quickly find themselves being idealized as a life goal, and an enabler of borderline abuse can be idealized as their defender, before being devalued and discarded themselves, and thus the cycle continues. One especially insipid feature of exposure to an abuser, even outside of the context of targeted abuse, especially when that abuser is surrounded by other enablers to legitimize their claims, in other words, an echo chamber, is the adaptation to and the adoption of their worldview. Even in the absence of the abuser, the enabler could pick up behaviors from the abuser either consciously, for instance, if the enabler has been convinced that abusing people is good, actually, or unconsciously, for instance, if the abuser provides a model for an interaction they've never done before. In the informal discourse, these learned behaviors are referred to as narcissistic or borderline fleas, and also sometimes situational narcissism. Situational narcissism also has parallels to, for instance, situational depression, where it's not really a deep-set disorder as much as it is a transient maladaptation. But situational narcissism and narcissism are still functionally narcissism. However, here we see another upside. Because the enabler does not actually have the same set of deep-seated memories and life experiences that caused the disorder to develop in the first place, because they don't have the same core content as a pathological abuser, these learned behaviors, or fleas, can be much easier to overcome. The best way to avoid becoming an enabler, or target of abuse, or really any adverse effects at all, is to avoid contact with abusive individuals altogether, and the only way to do that is to know what abusive individuals look like. This means doing the research. You can't stay away from something if you don't know what it looks like. And again, like depression and anxiety, narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder don't have any obvious physical signs, necessarily, like physical illnesses like asthma or the flu. Instead, they have behavioral symptoms, which require close attention and observation to accurately analyze. Again, a quick reminder of my credentials: none, 0. I have a degree in Google. However, there is a wealth of information out there for those who are willing to look, even technical information from the DSM-5. The current manual psychologists use here in America to diagnose mental health disorders is only a quick search away. For instance, here are the current definitions for narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, that I refuse to read out loud. You can do that shit for yourself. This video is long enough already. However, there are a couple things to know before applying these definitions to the real world. First, it's worth noting again that not everyone with NPD or BPD will become abusive. Furthermore, just because someone fits all these criteria from your point of view does not necessarily mean that they actually have either disorder. There is nuance to a full diagnosis that only a qualified mental health professional can actually be able to judge. And even they can only properly diagnose someone who actually decides to go in for therapy. That is to say, someone who takes their own recovery into their own hands. Besides, because every situation is different, because every human being is different, it is impossible for this video to cover all the bases, even if I could see through the screen and into your inner world. So again, please treat the information in this video as a jumping off point for your own research, and then decide how to apply that research to your situation for yourself. And remember, In the same way that you can only change if you want to change, you cannot make someone else change unless they want to change as well. If an abusive individual decides that they want to continue abusing people, there's not really much you can do for them. Furthermore, if their target of abuse is you, then sticking around to change them will only expose you to further abuse, and all the adverse psychological effects thereof. But, if you do find yourself in an abusive situation, the best thing for you to do is to quietly distance yourself from your abuser, and use what information you have about your own circumstances to research a resolution. Trust me on that one. I call myself Shouts. So, to review, we've touched on the concept of abusive relationships, the abusers that cause those abusive relationships, their targets of abuse, the enablers of abusive relationships, and some of the factors that could lead to an abusive relationship's formation. We even have some idea of why abusers are abusers in the first place. Abuse doesn't necessarily come from a place of contempt or hatred, but it can also come from fear or self-hatred, or even out of a misguided sense of justice. In other words, abusers aren't some kind of mysterious, unknowable monster in human skin, no matter what the YouTube comments tell you. They are, ultimately, human beings, with their own histories and personalities and patterns of behavior. They can be understood. And maybe there's something you can do. If you or someone you care about is in an abusive relationship, as the abusee, as the abuser, whatever, no matter what, if anything, you actually decide to do, the only way you can respond effectively is if you're mentally and emotionally ready to take action. This means, of course, taking proper care of yourself, as we spoke about in the first part of this video with Benman and Dicknose, who are doing fine, by the way. They weren't in this segment because they deserve to be happy. By the way, in case you were wondering, Dicknose did get to drive the backhoe after all. I'm the author. I can just do that. It's a scary thing if you think about it. And if you are the target of abuse, then self-care is especially important. In the short term, anxiety and depression are both common in abuse survivors. In addition, so is shame, hopelessness, fear, and confusion, especially in cases of emotional manipulation such as gaslighting. Other direct results of abuse could involve the abusee withdrawing from society, refusing to listen to information that doesn't come approved by their abuser, and the increasing contortion of their life around their abuser as they try to improve what little they are allowed of their own lives. The effects of long-term abuse, and thus long-term exposure to short-term effects, could not only entail mental adaptations and habit forming, but the body physically adapting to an environment of stress. Emotional instability, sleep disturbance, depression, and random physical pain are all common. Long-term abuse can even lead to, as we touched on before, the development of a whole new mental disorder, such as PTSD or even borderline or narcissism, which all stem directly from traumatic events. In other words, the cycle can continue. So, in the words of my psychologist, in the words of a pre-flight safety video, quotes, and I'm being totally serious, put on your own mask first, before assisting others. But if you're not sound enough to take care of yourself, then what you might need is support. For instance, from your friends and family. Or from a professional like a counselor or therapist. And personally, and I'm not sponsored or anything, which means I get to talk all the shit I want, I actually recommend BetterHelp. It's like $40 a session with financial aid, which is built into the service and doesn't even require insurance or anything, so like $160 USD a month. It's convenient, you can access it anywhere, in America for sure, but also internationally I think, at any time, and it is way more effective than people give it credit for. It isn't quite full therapy, insofar as it's an online service and thus you are not sharing physical space with your counselor, but whoever you get matched up with is a fully qualified mental health professional. They just can't do anything more complicated than quote-unquote talk therapy, which is fine, actually. For a lot of people, that's all they need. However, before you go into therapy, online or offline, there are two things you should know about therapists. First, therapists, like doctors, are human beings, which means that there can be variance in the quality of treatment due to the skill level of the therapist. However, if you find a therapist that suits you, you should probably stick with them. One great way to complicate recovery is to constantly bounce between multiple professionals who just have to fucking guess where you left off with the last one. So please be thankful to your therapist, and at least don't bully them, okay? And second, therapists, also like doctors, genuinely want to help you. Regardless of whatever differences you and your therapist have, and regardless of any incentives, most therapists want to help people in the same way that doctors want to help people. They want to ease suffering and aid in recovery. In fact, my therapist explicitly told me that she wanted to get me to a place where I could take care of myself through self-therapy, so I would be able to spend less time in therapy and more time living my life. While there are, of course, bad therapists, and Freud-era psychology apparently was really just an elaborate scam that just happened to accidentally progenate modern medicine, the modern practice of psychology is an effective and efficient tool to improve the lives of people suffering poor mental health. CBT, again, cognitive behavioral therapy, although we were just talking about Freud, so I can see how you get confused, CBT is, for instance, a treatment method that attempts to deprogram maladaptive behavior by identifying and targeting the root cause of a patient's problems. And then, with the help of a therapist, the patient develops techniques to replace the problematic behavior with a healthier adaptation. So now, with the advent of cheap and effective online treatment, I don't think there's any good reason to pass up cognitive behavioral therapy anymore. Just raw CBT on its own without any medication has a 50 to 75% success rate for overcoming depression and anxiety over the course of 8 to 15 sessions. Both mental health problems that can hassle you for years if untreated, that can suddenly be resolved in a matter of months. But we've touched on this. Stats and studies can be cold and hard to visualize. Without a human experience to attach them to, they're just kinda numbers. So, for the sake of argument, allow me to present my own story, which is, as a non-fiction, necessarily incomplete. I don't know all the details, I definitely don't have all the answers, and the only person I know for sure is myself. But, if you were to ask me right now, I would say that CBT saved my life. So, November 2019, I discovered that I am an abuse survivor. According to my psychologist, a close friend of mine had subjected me to emotional, mental, and sexual abuse over the course of several years, and as a result, I developed a condition called codependency, now known as self-love deficit disorder. Additionally, during my abuse and in the immediate aftermath, I had to deal with what is apparently non-clinical depression, although I did deal with it for months at a time, which does confuse things a little bit. I also dealt with anxiety and a bunch of other maladaptive learned behaviors that it's taken some time for me to disentangle. But it seems like the worst is behind me. So, here are a bunch of additional and admittedly kind of disorganized insights into mental health directly out of my own experience. Codependency is a weird one. As a full disorder, it usually appears comorbid with something like borderline, but I somehow managed to get just codependency, and a bunch of borderline and narcissistic fleas. In the modern DSM, it's also called self-love deficit disorder, and I would almost describe it as something like a kind of pseudo-narcissism. It's characterized by shame and self-hatred, like narcissism, and stems from abuse, like narcissism, but instead of creating a false self as a defense mechanism, in order to cover up that sense of shame and self-hatred, someone with codependency just stares that internalized sense of shame right in the fucking face, and resolves to be a quote-unquote better person to the point of becoming pathologically self-sacrificing. Which is bad enough as it is already, but as a result of codependency often stemming from abuse, someone with codependency isn't necessarily living up to their own high standards. They've been convinced to judge themselves based off of someone else's. And like any other disorder, codependency is pretty predictable. In practice, someone might end up getting codependency by getting worn down by external abuse until they internalize the idea that they were a bad person, but that they could redeem themselves by being gregarious and self-sacrificing and proving to whatever their arbiter of morality was that they were in fact a good person. And if they can live up to those expectations and prove themselves to be a good person, then their existence would be validated. They would deserve to be seen and to be heard and have the things that they have and be who they want to be, and in short, they would be treated like a human being. However, if they were a bad person, then that quote-unquote privilege is revoked. Not only would they not deserve any of those things, but they must forfeit all of those things because they are taking them from someone who deserves them more. And again, what constitutes bad behavior is arbitrary and decided by their abuser. So, unlike someone with NPD who becomes super egotistical, codependents are marked by a lack of self-esteem, by a lack of self-love, as a result of being convinced to perceive themselves as evil and unworthy of love. This externally engineered lack of self-esteem, this unhealthy absence of an ego, often manifests as someone with codependency actively ignoring their own needs and circumstances in order to play a part to satisfy the needs of others, and justify their own existence. Classic codependent bullshit can involve someone acting like they're invincible to keep people from worrying about them, denying that others have hurt them in the face of obvious harm, and laughing off their suffering by making jokes like, "You can't hurt me, my penis is enormous." Paraphrased. From me. Which is a joke, mind you. It's just, you can laugh at that. It just happens to also be real. And again, all this posturing can read almost like a narcissistic false self. After all, codependency does share the same wound, and thinks that they are fundamentally worthless and deserving of shame. But someone suffering codependency isn't really trying to build themselves up, especially by hurting others. They're trying to assure others that they're okay, and that they aren't broken, and that they shouldn't be abandoned before they can prove their worth. before they can prove that they're worthy of love. Here we can also see some parallels to borderline personality disorder. In fact, borderline is commonly comorbid with codependency, like we mentioned before, and codependency can, like how I described borderline, be emotionally manipulative and controlling without really intending to manipulate or control anyone. For instance, if a codependent has internalized the idea that they're a bad person from wherever the fuck, and the only respite that they get from that self-hatred is from others telling them that they're good, then they can find themselves going even further out of their way to maintain a relationship at all costs. Begging, pleading, compromising themselves, even setting aside their goals for the sake of proving their worth. And of course, this is a form of controlling behavior, and it's not healthy for the codependent or their source of, for lack of a better term, codependent supply. The whole situation can be emotionally exhausting for both parties and terrifying for the codependent, not entirely unlike the situation with borderline. However, in the context of an abusive relationship, especially the relationship that caused the codependency in the first place, where the person with codependency is not the person in control of the relationship, codependency just serves as a grip. Like we mentioned before, a handhold for manipulation. This tendency towards self-sacrifice and ignoring incoming harm can result in the perpetuation of existing abusive relationships, or even lead to the codependent being picked up by another abuser. However, there's hope. In fact, there's a lot of hope. Codependency in particular is a learned behavior in a world where something called cognitive behavioral therapy exists. At least in my case, dealing with codependency was as straightforward as identifying the problem, that I was abused, and replacing my conditioning with something more constructive, like not putting up with abuse. Hell, the biggest complication in my recovery was that my abuser was still abusing me while I was trying to recover. Or, at least, I was still stuck in their cycle. And what is also very interesting is that, while codependency probably stemmed from my quote-unquote neutral personality, that is to say, what I'm like when I'm not being abused, my disorder was not, and never really was, my personality. Kinda like how you aren't a cold or a broken leg or any other kind of physical illness. Like, even now, when I've more or less gotten over my codependency, I still enjoy being generous, and I still enjoy making things, and I still enjoy helping people. I still enjoy telling jokes, and in fact, my repertoire has become bigger than ever. In fact, if anything, even though some of those traits did contribute to me developing my codependency, I still enjoy those parts of myself, in fact, now more than ever, knowing that it isn't symptomatic of some kind of secret essential wrongness. I never had to ditch anything about my personality, is what I'm trying to say. I just had to learn to keep my personality from turning, or rather, being used, against me. So, something we keep coming back to in this video is the idea that mental health is not a meter, right? And now we have an idea of all the myriad things that can go wrong, and we can see that mental health is more like a bunch of discrete problems that can be treated individually. And while they can be tangled up, and some problems can influence others, it isn't like once you're mentally unwell, you just start acting crazy, and vice versa. In fact, just because you do something that is atypical does not necessarily mean that you have a mental health problem. The span of quote-unquote normal, healthy human behavior is a lot wider than some people might think. For instance, here's a turn, kink is not an indicator of mental health. Kink is just another form of adaptation. For instance, someone being into bondage does not necessarily indicate that someone has, for instance, unresolved issues with control, or secretly wants to predate people, or is secretly the guy from 50 Shades of Grey. Nor will they suddenly grow an issue like that if they are, big quotes, pushed to the edge, unbig quotes. In fact, kink just means that they've acclimated to, or are open-minded enough to just outright accept, a non-mainstream whatever the fuck. In fact, if anything, kink might actually improve your mental health by clarifying boundaries between fantasy and reality and helping to open your mind to new points of view outside of the mainstream. Although, that is not to say that kink is never a problem in relationships, it just means that it isn't always a problem. Hold that thought, we're going to be back to that one in a second. But similarly, phobias do not necessarily indicate poor mental health either. Wait, no, hold on, shout here for the more recent past. Most of the script was written in like February to March and then rewritten and edited and fact-checked sporadically until it was finished in like April 2020. Because this was a really hard video to make for obvious psychological reasons, and Jesus fuck, it's a 3-hour podcast! No wonder it took so long! And anyway, somehow I only caught this mistake now, like a million rewrites in. I was gonna say that phobias don't always indicate poor mental health, and just because you're scared of stuff does not mean you have some kind of problem. Which is technically true, but kind of misleading. Apparently phobias do tend to indicate poor mental health insofar as they often indicate some kind of anxiety disorder. However, having a phobia does not indicate that you are just flat-out general-purpose umbrella terminology insane, which is the point I was trying to make in the stock version of this segment. A point that I still think holds true. Just because you're scared of the water segments from Half-Life does not necessarily mean you'll suffer other complications. Like, just because you had anxiety, you're also bound to develop borderline and narcissism and codependency and whatever else the fuck. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're just afraid of ichthyosaurs either. In other words, sometimes it's nothing, and sometimes it's something. People are not absolutes. In fact, the span of normal human behavior is actually so wide that anything can be a problem, but not necessarily everything is a problem. Similarly, in the context of abuse and manipulation, anything can be an attempt to control someone, but not necessarily everything is an attempt to control someone. And ultimately, the only person who can judge whether or not something is causing a problem for you is you. So if someone starts to judge you or shame you or psychoanalyze you because you want to fuck the fishman from The Shape of Water, you can decide for yourself whether or not you spend too much time looking up reverse mermaid porn, or whether to gently place their judgment in the trash. But there's nuance to the idea that not everything is a problem, of course. Abusers, for instance, love this trope because they can just gaslight someone into thinking that nothing is wrong. Almost effortlessly, too. As we touched on before, it is very possible for an abusee to not realize that they're being abused, especially if codependency is involved, because abusees, for whatever reason, are prone to overlooking their own abuse. Part of the reason is probably that, again, abuse can be subtle and insidious, but part of it could also be that it's really difficult to accept that someone you trust is, intentionally or unintentionally, hurting you. So, even without a pathology like codependency, it's common for survivors of abuse to rationalize their abuser's behavior by saying things like, I shouldn't have made them mad, or I should have been more thoughtful, or I know they didn't mean it, or I should have been more clear, as if it were their fault that someone else decided to abuse them. And similarly, it can take very little effort to convince someone in an abusive situation, that is to say, someone who could be suffering impaired judgment or viewing the world through their abuser's lens, or even exhibiting full-on codependent behavior. It can take very little to convince a target of abuse that they are not being abused. In my own experience, and this is ridiculous in hindsight, you're right, so it's okay to laugh, there were multiple points in my own abuse where I would get the gut feeling that something was wrong, but without any useful information, I wouldn't know exactly what. And the only source I trusted on the matter was my abuser. So I would ask my abuser what was happening, and my abuser would, obviously in retrospect, just straight up tell me that I wasn't being abused, and in fact, I was abusing them, and that I should be grateful that they kept me around. And I just believed it? Like, after all, I trusted them. They were confident, they had experience with this kind of thing. They had more people on their side, and they seemed to know or see something in me that I couldn't. And moreover, I had already learned, or rather, I had been taught, they had already taught me, to stop trusting my judgment. So in retrospect, they probably would have bought it either way. It was only towards the end of our relationship, only towards the discard, only once I began to resist their coercion, or rather, once I began to misunderstand their signals, so I don't know how much my agency factored into this one either. Only once I began to seemingly resist that coercion did my abuser have to more obviously manipulate me with accusations and ultimatums. And I only really realized that after the fact, with the help of my therapist, and even more abuse to use as a point of reference. So, in other words, and again, I was suffering codependency at the time, so take this with a grain of salt, it was not at all obvious to me what was going on in the moment. I was too busy making sure that the people I cared about felt validated and satisfied and happy, and that nobody I cared about was about to leave me, or worse. Which was, of course, all an attempt to legitimize myself against my abuser, who convinced me that I needed to legitimize myself to them in the first place. Which means I was literally too busy being abused to realize I was being abused. But again, that's the thing about abusers. It's almost like a con. It's easy to see in retrospect, especially with better information and a clearer head and a quote-unquote objective lens, and a psychologist. But it's worth remembering that abuse is not always that kind of obvious manipulation, or emotional dysfunction, or irrational demands, or anything dramatic like that. The quote-unquote little things, almost like microaggressions that an abuser can play off as just a joke, can be just as dangerous as well. Sexual abuse, here's a term, for instance, does not require contact. Sexual abuse can also be the quote-unquote little things, like pressuring someone into a sexual relationship, or pressuring someone to exposing information about themselves, or even pressuring someone into consenting to their own harassment. Consenting, big air quotes, to their own harassment. In this way, even without resorting to anything as transparent as physical force, the abuser can still quote-unquote force themselves onto their target and coerce them into behavior that they would not otherwise perform. And of course, this is an abuser we're talking about here, so of course, sexual abuse can also open the door to further abuse and manipulation, by giving an abuser especially ugly information to twist against their target. However, again, this is not to say that every little thing is abuse either. Even in healthy relationships, there will be conflicts. For instance, someone can transgress a boundary, which I just realized we haven't talked about at all, or someone can make a mistake, or someone can say something they didn't mean, or someone can take something innocent the wrong way. This is just the way that human communication is right now, and in a way, that's kind of okay, because in a healthy relationship, people can just talk out those differences. Because a healthy relationship can usually recognize, or at least intuit, that there are all sorts of things that can affect your judgment that are entirely situational. For instance, forgetfulness can be caused by just everyday stress and anxiety, which can also cause you to misinterpret information. Something like that only becomes a problem when it becomes a pattern, as far as psychology is concerned. But maybe communication is a topic for another time. Psychology is, obviously, an entire field of science. Even in the context of this video, there's all sorts of stuff we haven't touched on. Like, we've barely scratched the surface when it comes to personality disorders. Like, we haven't touched on narcissistic wounds and narcissistic rage, or borderline rage, which is similar but for different reasons. We haven't talked about how hoovering works, which is again a very silly word for when an abuser discards someone and then graciously takes them back and starts the cycle over again. We haven't talked about the importance of quote-unquote healthy boundaries and how abusers can tear them down and how codependency can stem from the destruction of those boundaries, and more. There's all sorts of stuff to talk about, but this video has already gone on really long, so I will leave that homework up to you. But if you, or someone you know, do end up doing the research, and find that you are, or have been, in an abusive relationship, then again, I personally believe that your next step should be therapy. Whatever therapist you end up with will be miles more knowledgeable than some punk YouTube video on the subject. They'll be able to comfort you after whatever has happened, help you make sense of whatever situation you found yourself in, and they'll be able to give you all sorts of tools to expedite your recovery so you can make a more informed decision about what to do next. For instance, I never got closure from my abuser, which is, in retrospect, a very typical abuser thing to do, which was probably part of the reason why I stuck around as long as I did. I think I was in some kind of shelf phase of some kind of idealization, devaluation, discard cycle. Like I said before, I considered them a close friend, and in fact, they even told me that they felt the same way, but that didn't stop the discard. I never even got the chance to say goodbye. I did eventually get closure, but only as a result of therapy, in the form of unclouded hindsight. Only then, I think, did I really begin to recover. So, I started therapy back in November 2019, and I discovered that 1, I had been abused, and 2, as a result, I had developed a bunch of weird learned behaviors. The term my psychologist used was conditioning, so think like Pavlov's dog. We got to work on that shit, right away, and all that garbage had been replaced by, January. Not to say that it's been a clean sweep. There are still some days where I'll be, in the shower or staring at the ceiling or something, and I'll find myself thinking of capital S, some capital B bullshit that my abuser said about me, and I'll have to talk myself back down, and I'll be like, no, that really was out of my control. They can't blame me for that. I did the best that I could. It's not my fault they took it that way. And then out comes the fucking little white journal, and now I'm suddenly scribbling about some bullshit, and then I have to self-therapize myself back down to earth again. But it's a lot better than the alternative, which is, and was, crying my eyes out while I'm trying to get literally any kind of work done. Because I'm so ashamed that I had wronged the one person that I was convinced to, or rather, who had convinced me that would ever care about me. And that wrongness was not only my fault, but essential to my personality. So if I wasn't wrong right now, then it was a matter of time until I sinned again. But these days, especially after therapy, those episodes are getting further and further apart. Mostly because I think I don't have time for that shit. Maybe that's one of the upsides to being a content creator. I can't let years of abuse and manipulation get me down. I've got shit to do. I've got games to make, which is kind of absurd, especially given my track record and how overwork probably helped land me in the situation in the first place. But I think part of the reason why I was so receptive to therapy was because I had already had enough of my abuse hijacking my life. And I wanted to get back to fucking work already. For instance, there were times, and here's a turn, it's gonna get dark, if you want to skip it, here's a timestamp. There were times where I seriously considered suicide. One time, for instance, driving home in particularly terrible condition, I considered just veering into oncoming traffic and just getting the whole thing over with. The only reason I stopped myself was because if I died, then I'd never be able to apologize to everyone in my life, especially my abuser, but everyone around them too, for being so selfish or dishonest or delusional or immoral. So I didn't commit suicide, and I got home and I was terrified and emotionally fried and utterly disappointed in myself for even thinking about suicide, and staring up at the ceiling again and crying until I passed out on the spot. And then I went on hiatus because the first rational thing that popped into my head, like easily a day later when I woke up, wasn't I'm being abused, or I don't deserve this, or something is going on, but, well, I definitely can't work like this. But what's crazy is I was already extremely compromised before that, and I was just pushing myself to work anyway. Like, I would literally get up, roll out of bed, and drag myself to my computer and start trying to draw or write or program or whatever the fuck, while simultaneously, everything I did, all the work that I did, reminded me of my abuser and how wrong I had been and how evil I had been, and maybe if I just did everything right and admitted to everything that they said I'd done wrong, and if I never complained and if I never gave up and never even looked like I'd done something wrong, then maybe they would forgive me. And I thought that was normal? Like, literally being unable to see through my own tears was just normal. Like, this is just, according to my abuser, what life is supposed to be like. This is the grind. God damn, I fucking hate that fucking word. And I should be grateful that I don't have to work like those peons in retail. And I just took it. Like, again, my abuser seemed to know something that I didn't, and I clearly couldn't trust myself, so whatever, I guess this is normal now. I wasn't normal before, but this is normal now. So, I just dealt with it. Like, because if I didn't, someone calling themselves my best friend would say something like, "What are you, a poser? Suffer like Cuphead did." And they'd go out and tell all our friends about whatever it is I've done today, and I'd never see them again. Suffer like Cuphead did. That's how I remember my quote-unquote best friend. Obviously that's paraphrased, right? My abuser did not literally say, "Suffer like Cuphead did." Although I do think they did come pretty damn close. Besides that, that's how I remember March, April, May, June, July 2019. I certainly was not useful for definitely 3 months, and I was practically comatose for at least one. But what's interesting is, I can laugh about it now, I can joke about it now, it's uncomfortable, obviously. I'd appreciate it if Suffer Like Cuphead did not become a meme, so use some fucking discretion. But all that happened not even a year ago, and to me it's already in the past. Like, remember how we talked about self-forgiveness and self-awareness and self-compassion? This might be what it could look like when someone is able to self-forgive. Even though I remember what it was like to know them and be exposed to them and at least most of the things that they did to me, again, I've been pretty compromised, I don't really feel like I regret meeting my abuser, if that makes any sense. Like I said, by my understanding, all that shit's over now, and I know their background well enough, or at least I think I know them well enough, to understand where they're coming from and forgive them. Although obviously I'm not exactly excited to talk to them right now. And now that I'm mostly over my codependency, I can see that it never should have been my job to make sure that they felt happy or felt validated or felt powerful or whatever the fuck they were trying to get out of me. Especially at the cost of my own health. God, I don't know about them, but I feel almost invigorated or even enlightened. Like I spent the last couple of years dicking around in the dark and now I can see it was just a really long tunnel. Like, just off the top of my head, I'm energetic again, I can sleep right again, well in theory at least. I can think straight again, I can relate to other people again. Hey, did you know that abuse is actually really common? About 50% of people in America will be emotionally abused this year. Like, my art and productivity have both improved massively and are in fact way better than it ever was before I got abused, which is fucking hysterical, because my abuser was constantly trying to get me to be less of an auteur. All that just because I've learned not to listen to that voice in my head, that someone else's voice in my head, calling me dishonest or immoral or delusional or ungrateful for not being the thing they wanted me to be. Because I've learned, or maybe just remembered, that the only person who can judge me is me. So, obviously, better mental health has its wellness benefits, but better mental health can also help protect you. It's a lot harder for an abuser to get their hands on you if they don't have an issue to grab onto. So maybe developing mentally healthy habits and the skills surrounding them, so building self-awareness, building your communication skills, building your self-esteem, building better boundaries, which again we just straight up have not talked about, so maybe look those up yourself. Developing healthy habits can help protect you from abusers, not necessarily by making you less attractive to them or repelling them in some way, but by making it harder for them to worm their way into your life. Obviously, there's not much you can do if some rando decides to just turn against you. If someone decides to start shit, you just kind of have to deal with the fallout. But that doesn't mean you have to play their game. Just because they're trying to pull on your psychological strings doesn't mean you have to give an abuser any of your time, your trust, your attention, or any space inside your head. All you have to do is learn to protect yourself. And all you have to do that is do the research. And don't think you're alone either, at least not anymore. The world at large might still have a little bit of mental health stigma going around, but like we touched on before, we're getting better about talking about this kind of thing. So maybe it's only a matter of time until we see some kind of big breakthrough. We still have some shit to deal with, of course. Pop, or rather folk psychology like essentialism is still quite popular, the idea that people have an underlying true self that is immutable and will never change. Which is, of course, not entirely unfounded. Remember, NPD deals with a quote-unquote false self, and abusers are prone to not changing. It's just that it's not a complete understanding. It's kind of like Newtonian physics, in that it's lowercase a accurate without being capital T true. Like, without proper scrutiny, the concept can, for instance, serve abusers by helping them scapegoat their targets as essentially wrong, and thus deserving their abuse, or deny an actual abuser's ability to change, or even confuse a layman into thinking that they are essentially evil for making some kind of human mistake. But at the same time, because mental health problems are becoming more and more common, and because the proliferation of social media makes these problems more and more public, and because people can be so casually wrong, more and more people have started talking about and interacting with the problem. Like fuck, you've gotten through this whole video now, haven't you? Honestly, at this rate, I actually think that memeing wholesomely about taking care of your own mental health might start looking like how people meme wholesomely about staying hydrated. I've actually started seeing some jokes about therapists, not just like the Gajinka grunty isn't real and can't hurt you stuff, but like jokes about being vulnerable around therapists and how people act differently around their therapists than like the rest of the world. I've seen jokes like that start cropping up. And it's only like the beginning of 2020, so if I know anything about the fucking internet, that pattern is only going to accelerate, especially if people start to really do their research and start to take their own mental health seriously. And finally, understanding abuse. Understanding that it can fuck with your judgment, understanding what it looks like, and understanding how to stop it, can allow you to help stop the cycle of abuse from perpetuating itself through others. Remember, abuse does not come exclusively from some kind of pathology. Even without an explicit personality disorder, like narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, someone with an abusive worldview, for instance, someone suffering narcissistic or borderline fleas from their own exposure to an abuser, can become an abuser themselves. And these non-pathological abusers can have their own enablers. They can engage in their own manipulation, and they can be impossible to tell apart from someone with an explicit disorder. This means that, in a way, abuse can be contagious. But abuse is not contagious like a cold or the flu. Remember, abuse isn't a symptom. You can't infect someone by just passing them on the street. Abuse is a behavior. And like any behavior, it can be imitated in the service of personal gain. Abuse, not just a mistake, not a misunderstanding, but abuse is a choice. A choice that can become a habit, that can become a pattern. But by gaining an understanding, and by seeing abuse for what it is, you can step back, and you can see that pattern, and you can see the choices set out before you. And the cycle of abuse can end with you. Okay, so, we've learned about stress, anxiety, burnout, depression, self-care, self-compassion, disorders, abusers, abuse, and therapy. We've also touched on some particular disorders like BPD, NPD, and codependency, also known as self-love deficit disorder. We've also learned about the difference between a full disorder and learned behaviors, and I've shared a couple of my own disorganized insights from my boots-on-the-ground experience. So there's only one thing left that I want to talk about in this video. What to do if it turns out that you were the abuser. So, here's the situation. It's the end of 2017. I, like me, have run a moderately successful Kickstarter campaign, and I've got some extra money to throw around. So I decided to reach out to a fellow game dev, someone I've known personally, but not that personally, for what I thought would be a quick programming job. I'd known the guy for a couple of years at that point, and knew him well enough to know that he's a hard worker, that he's had a string of bad luck, and I think he really deserves another shot. But we weren't really friends, per se. I'd tease him about stuff like lerping, and he'd tease me back about my guns, but we weren't really close, we just kinda bantered. So I offer him the job, and he's tentative, because again, he's had a string of bad luck, and he doesn't really consider himself a programmer. But that didn't really bother me, because 1, it's a small job anyway, and 2, I'm pretty sure that's the anxiety talking. So, after a little while, he decides to trust my judgment. So, I hire the guy as a contractor, and I do everything I can to help him deal with his anxiety. He's just a contractor at this point, but we're talking rev share and upfront pay. I give him first dibs on being my programmer both on this project and the next. I get him to sign a contract, which was noted by my lawyer who wrote the contract, as explicitly to protect him from me. And I even set up this elaborate, big reveal exit strategy, so when he's done with my game, he can use the momentum for my project to help benefit his own project, whatever that happened to be next. But in retrospect, that was a lot, and definitely did not help his anxiety at all. But, unrelated to that, times are tough, right out of the gate, especially on my side. Deals are falling through, hiring is going bad, I'm mismanaging the whole project because I'm suddenly having to deal with, a bunch of management-level roles that I've never had to deal with before, because it used to be only me working on these kinds of things. But because hiring has gone bad, we're still understaffed. So not only am I doing all of that, I'm also juggling all the hats that I would usually wear on these kinds of projects as art and programming and everything. And as a result, I'm not giving the guy any useful information, and he's all stressed out because he thinks it's his fault, and I'm pushing him too hard, and in retrospect, there were a million reasons for problems going on outside of both of our control. And then, suddenly, as a result of some of those problems, my programmer enters what I now recognize as a serious depression. And I try to coax him out of it, first gently, telling him stuff like, you can't stay depressed forever, and I know you're tougher than that, and you'll be okay, rub some psycho dirt in it. And then, when this obviously did not work, and his depression got worse, I tried to push him to power through it. His problem was that he was dwelling on the past too much, and he just needed to suck it up. And it's oh god. So, when that all didn't work, obviously, I asked a friend for advice, and they said my programmer was actively taking me for a ride. And I didn't believe it at first, but as things continued to develop and that line kept bouncing around in my head, and my mental state started to deteriorate as a result of everything going on, that was how I began to think of my programmer. And that was how I started to treat him. Not as if he were a person dealing with everything in the world at the moment, but an enemy who was actively trying to take advantage of me, who only ever wanted to take advantage of me, who had planned to sabotage the project for his own gain from the very beginning, and it was a mistake for me to ever trust him. But I only had allegations. I didn't have any proof, just the rumors, what people told me. I would get sentences without context, or I would hear, I saw him doing this, and this behind your back, and that kind of thing. But that was enough. So between those allegations and the stress of the situation, and the way that I found myself viewing all this behavior, the things that I could actually see when we talked, the way that I found myself viewing his behavior through this lens that he was some kind of saboteur, I was so certain that it was true that I never asked him for his side of the story. Because, after all, if he was a saboteur and he knew I was onto him, it would cause a fight. Or worse. And then someone who is completely innocent, by the way, just think of them as just a random passerby, someone found me proof. And it was nothing. It was barely anything, but it was enough. It was enough for me. So, I made things worse. It was not his fault. I only realized what I'd done to the guy after I discovered that I had been abused. And it wasn't even a revelation either. It wasn't the incident was always in the back of my mind and I was just like once I got clarity, I instantly realized that he wasn't the problem. I wasn't even thinking about him to begin with. It was just something that happened to come up while I was thinking about all the shit that my abuser had fed me over the years. And I realized the narrative I had accepted didn't quite add up. Especially after talking to the guy and realizing that there had just been a really big misunderstanding and that my perception had been warped because I'd begin to view him through someone else's lens. That was when I realized what I'd put him through. Like, that's when I realized I told him to stop thinking for himself and to start thinking the way that I wanted him to. I stopped treating him like a human being, and I started treating him like a machine that wasn't doing his job. And then, when that didn't work, I took it as an offense, and I started to see him as like an enemy, and they started to treat him as like a traitor deserves. The instant I had the faintest proof that this guy was trying to hurt me. In other words, I abused him in the same way that my abuser abused me. And he forgave me. Apology is a form of acknowledgement. It shows to the person receiving the apology that their suffering has not gone unnoticed. It isn't a performance, nor is it a promise. If you say something like, "I'm sorry your house burned down," you are not saying, "I think houses burning down is bad, thus proving my superior morality," nor are you saying, "I will personally prevent your house from ever burning down again." You're recognizing how surprised they must have been to hear the fire alarm, and how scared they must have been as they were crawling under the smoke. An honest apology is recognition of those feelings. Proof of seeing another as a fellow human being who can suffer and feel pain and feel hurt, and an acknowledgement that those feelings matter. In other words, it's a form of respect. Sometimes this respect can beget forgiveness, a release of anger and resentment that allows an individual to finally move on from whatever experience caused that pain and hurt in the first place. It does not necessarily mean that the person will expose themselves to that same pain again, but in the same way that apologizing is a form of respect, forgiveness can show the same. By acknowledging their aggressor's humanity, recognizing their fallibility, recognizing their ability to grow, looking past that surface behavior and into their inner world, an abusee can see the humanity in their abuser again as well. To hold on to hatred is also a choice. If someone makes that decision, there's not much you can do to stop them. That's something that they have to work out for themselves. But forgiveness is possible. Even after abuse, even after resentment, an abuser and abusee can come to understand each other and see each other for what they are again. Not as monsters or machines, but as peers, as people. People who can grow and evolve and be who they want to be, if they're given the love and kindness and time and space that they deserve. If the only thing perpetuating this cycle of abuse is a poor understanding, a poor mutual understanding, if the only thing perpetuating the cycle is that people aren't seeing each other as people, then obtaining that understanding can not only stop that cycle, it could even prevent further suffering. Almost like a vaccination. Like, once you know how the system works, you know better than to let yourself be affected. And maybe, as our collective understanding of mental health improves, we'll gain a sort of herd immunity to problems like anxiety and depression and abuse. If even a basic understanding of these concepts becomes common knowledge, then nobody will ever have to go through what I went through, because nobody will be so naive as to fall for bullshit like thinking depression is a sign of weakness, or thinking that caring for others is a self-serving delusion, or thinking that if someone decides to abuse you, then it's your fault for making them mad. And I hope, if you're going through anything like what I've gone through, this video will jumpstart your recovery. Remember, people only change if they choose to change. But it is a choice. And that choice is up to you. If my abuser finds this video, which I think is actually fairly likely, then I think I'd like to say thank you. I'm sorry for all the confusion, and I'm sorry about the things that I said, and I'm sorry I wasn't of much help to you. I think I understand how we got here now, and as it stands, I'd rather we keep our distance. But I am happy to have met you, and I hope you're doing better. And I am happy to have considered you my friend. I know you have your circumstance. I know you too well to hate you. But, and I say this with love, boy am I glad that's over. Okay, time for the wrap-up. Time for the denouement. Here are some of the things that I've been doing over the course of my recovery, so if you are going through any of the bullshit I've been through, then maybe this could help give you some ideas on how to start your own recovery. So, like I said before, the very first thing that kicked off my recovery was my decision to go on hiatus. I disappeared off the internet, I stopped checking my phone, I turned off all the lights in my house, everything. I think, besides therapy, taking a nice long break to unpack all the things that had happened in my life was like the best decision that I've ever made, period. In retrospect, I think a lot of my vulnerability came from my work ethic, or rather, the holes in my understanding that my ludicrous single-minded indie dev work ethic had left in my life. Like, I was naive about all sorts of shit because I'd spent my entire adulthood, and honestly a big part of my adolescence, which is probably how I ended up this way, just working. I have almost literally never taken the time for myself. And the worst part is that it was never enough. Like, all someone would have to do to get me to do basically anything was tell me that I wasn't working hard enough. And, like, it doesn't matter that I spend almost, like, my entire waking life working on something. Like, I don't even know how to explain it. It used to be just this huge fuck-off gap in my armor. I didn't know what to do about it. And it was so easy to exploit. Until now. So, one habit I've picked up, or possibly rediscovered, is that I've become really, really studious, which helps to point that work ethic in a healthy direction. See, now that I'm not working on work, I can spend more time working on myself. So I started to dabble in psychology in an effort to understand myself, which led to me dabbling in classic history and literature in an effort to understand how other people understood themselves. And then I ended up getting into philosophy, trying to understand patterns in the way that people understand themselves. The jargon is epistemology. Thanks again, Philosophy Tube. Then I ended up getting into politics, not like quote-unquote practical modern American politics, like two-party politics, like how to win an election, but for lack of a better term, conceptual politics. I actually don't know the jargon for this one. Like, especially like Marxist theory, trying to work out exactly how people's philosophies could impact the real world. And then all of that led me back to psychology, trying to understand how I had been abused, and which ultimately led to my decision to go to therapy. Actually, I think the most interesting thing about all that study is that I've discovered that I fucking love to be wrong! Like, I fucking love it when some two-dimensional brain-dead misunderstanding of mine, especially when it comes to the humanities, turns out to not only be incorrect, but actively warping my perception of the world. Because whenever I do even like the slightest bit of research into the subject, that misunderstanding shatters, and is replaced with something that actually makes some kind of sense. Something with depth and nuance that I can begin to understand instead of just being an injustice that I have to just deal with, because that's just the way the world works. For instance, and here's a big fucking for instance, I used to be almost like a TERF, like a trans-exclusionary radical feminist, a feminist who supports cis women but not trans women, as if trans women didn't count as women. Jesus fucking Christ, you can fucking hear those fucking air quotes. And like, it's crazy, because I was convinced that being a TERF was the enlightened position, because I thought being trans was almost more like a lifestyle choice, and had seen some stats about how trans people have like really high suicide rates and tend to have lots of mental health problems. So I figured, if someone decided to make that choice, the choice to be trans, then they quote-unquote knew what they were signing up for. Like, I almost saw being trans as almost like being punk, but super extreme and admirable. So like, not like trans trending, which is like a pejorative, but like some kind of weird thing I didn't understand, where specifically rich white people would literally risk their lives in some kind of honestly kind of noble pursuit of the aesthetic? Like, God, I hope the trans ziz find that as silly as I do. And it turns out, all of that is bullshit. It looks like being trans is more like being gay, so like LGBT, in that there's a biological component that you can't control. And the reason why trans people have to deal with all these fucking mental health problems and struggle with depression is because dickheads like me are fucking out here unsupervised, prancing around, brainlessly regurgitating half-truths because for whatever reason, we just haven't done the research ourselves. Fuck! And it's crazy because I didn't even hate trans people or anything. At least I don't think I did. I wouldn't have called myself transphobic. I just thought that, like, trans people knowingly transition even though it's dangerous was just the end of the statement. And it's like, that's another admirable thing about trans people. They just willingly go off to die for the aesthetic. But then, obviously, I still had questions, right? Like, why would trans people become trans if they had also seen those statistics, right? Like, I knew it had to be more complicated than just, I want to be a pretty anime girl, or I want to be a vaporwave statue. No, not a statue of David, but like, a vaporwave statue. And I also had enough familiarity with homophobia to figure that it probably wasn't as simple as just, it was a choice, but at the same time, my sources told me not to think about it, so like, okay, whatever, I guess I won't think about it. And then, I suddenly found myself with lots of extra time. So I looked into it, and it turns out there's more to it than the there's more to it than the aesthetic. And moreover, there was something I could do. And that something I could do was stop being a TERF. And it's like, done! Got it! Transphobia is defeated. Surprise, fucker! This video is about trans rights all of a sudden. And what's really interesting is that caring is just another thing that I was totally convinced was some kind of delusion. The harsh truth that had been pushed onto me was that in the real world, nobody really cared about other people unless they stood to gain something. So, following this train of logic, the line of thinking that got inside my head, and fucking watch people rip this fucking line out of context, the line of thinking that got inside my head was that I never cared about anyone, and always had an ulterior motive, which of course my abuser would immediately then contrive into whatever they wanted me to do this time, and then feed it back to me. And I would just go, oh, I guess you're right, I'm just a big idiot, you know me better than I know me, I'm just too insane to think. God, the fuck! Like, I'm trying to avoid this line of thinking, but like, that's just where my headspace has been for the past year, if not longer. So another big thing that I got into is volunteer work, out of spite. Especially towards the beginning of my hiatus, when I had a lot of time on my hands and an equally large amount of post-abuse guilt. And at first, it was mostly just to convince myself that I was, in fact, a good person, and that my abuser was not actually right about me being an essentially incapable and fraudulent and insane human being. But then, I actually began to really enjoy volunteering, which is super hilarious because, like, even when they're right, they're wrong! So since then, I've actually started to do work for, like, conventions. I've built, like, wheelchair ramps. I wrote a YouTube video. I've started refurbishing and donating things like old TVs and furniture to, like, Goodwill and that kind of thing. I've even started helping out with, like, a handful of small game dev projects in secret, which was definitely partially inspired by someone else helping out with my projects in secret. So, in their honor, that will be the last I mention them. Speaking of, one thing I discovered in my adventure through politics is that I'm apparently some kind of closet anarchist, which does not mean what people think it means. Anarchy is less literally like Fallout raiders causing chaos in the streets, and more like no unjust hierarchies and yes mutual aid. The way I understand it, and I am not a scholar, is that anarchists think that, with no outside factors like scarcity to fight over or authorities telling them who to hate, humans basically just get along. It's a lot less violent and a lot more different than people give it credit for, in the same way that communism is not literally Soviet-style authoritarianism, where everybody is a statistic to the government, and is in fact basically the opposite. Soviet Russia had a lot of problems, don't get me wrong. It's just that most of those problems weren't communism, which was just the economic ideal, where people give what they can and take only what they need from a public pool of resources, to vastly oversimplify the matter. So, without proper context, without doing the research, you could confuse the USSR's problems, like supply shortages and authoritarianism and constant paranoia and the fucking Cold War going on in the background, as problems innate to communism, which dickheads like McCarthy were counting on. Anarchy suffers from a similar image problem for similar reasons. It isn't just nihilism, it just doesn't like violent or coercive power structures, because anarchists don't believe that people are inherently violent. In other words, if everyone has what they need, the only reason why one human being would hurt another human being, according to an anarchist, is socialization. Because someone else convinced them to do harm. Which I think is very interesting, because that's the plot of a video game that I'm working on right now that I thought was an elaborate parodic fantasy. More on that later. And fucking thank God, because I did think anarchists were just Fallout Raiders, and I thought communists were just what communists would call tankies. In other words, Stalinist-type communists who do actually exist, and do have their reasoning, I just don't agree with them. And now that I've dispelled that stupid nonsense and I can see anarchists and communists as human beings, my world is a better place, now that I've had the time to think about these things more than not at all. And I'm not even really saying that you need to follow specifically my political beliefs, I'm just saying that you should work out the hows and whys of what you believe in and see if it holds up to scrutiny. For instance, before all of this, I would have considered myself like a centrist, or even facetiously center-right, if only as a result of my environment and just kind of going along with the things that were going on in my environment. But now that I've thought about it, I think I identify more with anarcho-communism or ANCOM, because I want everyone to have the opportunity to grow like I did. The only reason I was able to support myself at all over this hiatus was because my lower middle class family was able to send me money and I happened to fall dick first into some decent but short-lived freelance work. And there are plenty of people who aren't that lucky. For instance, if things had gone even slightly differently, I could have really hurt my programmer. But fortunately, he has also fallen dick first into what sounds like the best work he's ever had in his life. Oh, speaking of anarchism, and speaking of the programmer, similarly, since I started my hiatus, I think I've become a full-on pacifist. It's actually a funny story. I nearly hit a guy with a table. I mean, I did not actually hit him with a table, but I was so frustrated with this friend of mine because I felt he wasn't listening to me, and in fact was being so casually hurtful and not listening to me when I said stop, that I felt the only way I could communicate that he was hurting me was through literal physical violence. I did apologize, though, and it's possible that he never even realized what I was thinking, although I do think that I was pretty transparently super fucking pissed. And, honestly, it wouldn't have even solved the problem. If my goal was to get the guy to listen to me, and I suddenly hit him with a table, all the guy would have learned from that interaction was to not be near me and tables. And, again, I really could have hurt him, and it wouldn't have solved a damn thing. But, fortunately, he's fine. I did not hit him with a table after all. And the reason I bring this up is because Programmer Guy is too, by the way. I got back in touch with him a little while ago, and apparently he noticed that something was up, and he made the very wise and healthy decision to avoid all of this shit like the plague. He's also started therapy, which is great, because he's taken his recovery into his own hands. Except, some of that was my fault. Not all of it, probably most of it. Speaking of, I've actually been on a little bit of an apology binge since I've gone on hiatus. Now that I've got this clear understanding of why I was doing all those shitty things, and it wasn't because I was an innately monstrous person and I needed to stop deluding myself that I actually cared about other people, I was able to reconnect with all sorts of people that I had abandoned, for lack of a better term, because I was convinced that they would hurt me, or worse, were holding me back. Which included, old co-workers and old friends and my parents, who had, again, been sending me money for months by the point that I finally touched base with them again. Actually, speaking of, there was this one dev in town who I apologized to after, years of mistreatment, because I discovered, basically by pure fucking chance, that the only reason I didn't like him was because, one, all this bullshit, and two, he was regurgitating bullshit from his own abuser. In his case, his literal boss, not just someone pulling his strings. And anyway, some things happened, and I think we accidentally got his boss to literally close down his business and join a band? Which I think is good. Apparently that's what he wanted? The impression I got is that everybody's happy now, because the whole business seemed like some kind of vanity project that had grown out of control. But that also meant the dev was out of a job, so I ended up doing some secret dev work for him as well, so that worked out, I think. It's taken some time, obviously, but making these rounds and forgiving people, and thank God being fucking forgiven in return, has been great for not just my mental health, but my physical health. It really was like dropping weights off my back, and in retrospect, the only reason I was carrying them was because someone convinced me that I should. Like, all I had to do was learn to stop taking that voice so fucking seriously, and suddenly I was taking care of myself again. Like, for instance, I've recently discovered that I've needed glasses. For years! Like, I used to just think that my monitor was bad, which it was old and refurbished. But it turns out that not only was I overworking the rest of my body, but I was overworking my eyes as well. Not only have I become farsighted, but I have this weird alarming blinking pattern, and I also appear to have developed glaucoma? Which is apparently harmless, but it's really fucking weird for my fucking age. I'm only like 25, and like, surely that's not the fucking pixel art, right? Like, that's not my fucking, like, my pixel art war wound scar from my time in the fucking pixel art mines, is it? Like, I'm still getting used to them. The glasses, I mean, not the pixel art. If I shit, it comes out in 24 by 24. But like, every once in a while, I'll like forget to put on my glasses before I leave the house, or like, I'll reach up to touch my face and bonk my fucking hand on the lenses like a fucking fish in a fishbowl. But I have managed to keep myself consistent, partially because, honestly, I think these fucking glasses make me look hot as goddamn. Which is a new and very interesting experience for me. See, I've also started dating again, and it's kind of embarrassing to say, but I haven't ever considered romantic interaction since like high school. It's not that I'm asexual or anything. In fact, I would consider myself like comically straight, or afraid of being vulnerable, or like not used to talking to girls or anything. I've just never had the time to take dating seriously, even before factoring in the whole fucking abuse situation. Like, if you were to ask me what my mindset was, basically until recently I felt that if I couldn't financially support my girlfriend, it would be disingenuous to string her along, so to speak, and honestly that was one factor in pushing me further and further into my work. On the bright side, it's 2020, and some girls are super into that. I actually think, or rather, I'm actually worried, that I have some kind of moe appeal going on, which honestly still kind of weirds me out because I'm not used to being attractive. Like, at all. And frankly, I'm kind of worried that I'll just get abused again, but the fact that I'm worried and know what I'm looking for probably means that I'll be okay. And, just in case anyone asks, no, I'm not interested in starting a relationship with anyone who knows me through my work. That is sweet, and I am flattered, but I think that would cause a weird power dynamic thing, and I'll have to respectfully decline. The point is, a big part of my recovery has just been getting my confidence back, which has been mostly an exercise in taking the initiative to go out and do things, especially things I've never done. For instance, I've become very social all of a sudden, even more social than I was before my abuse. Like, I've done some stand-up, I've done some public speaking, I've done some, I don't know how to describe this to an English-speaking audience, anime cheerleading? See, I somehow ended up at a premiere cheer screening, which turned out to be a sea of estrogen. So, to oversimplify things, they would start speaking up whenever some gay rights started happening, and I would start making noise whenever a robot showed up, or Imaishi started popping off, or Hiyama's character opened his big, loud mouth. At first, there was a little confusion, but we managed to reconcile our differences for the Gattai in the third act. I actually heard someone afterward, I think the event organizer, saying that they were really happy that there was a male voice popping off in the background there somewhere. She seemed actually really worried that the entire audience would be full of shippers, but like, dude, don't worry. I'll just start I'll start a one-man Owendan back here and just wait for people to join in. And they did. So that one is going on my portfolio. Super Robot Hype Man. I've also, getting back to the point, I've also joined a couple art groups in the area, and somehow become an administrator in one of them, and accidentally created another. And I also used to be a hypochondriac. Like, I used to assume every little pain was a sign of serious physical injury, and then I got in a car accident, and now I'm not a hypochondriac anymore. I don't know where else to put that, I just think it's really funny. But, at first, I did all of those things in spite of my abuse, almost as an act of defiance, to prove that nobody else could control my life. But, at some point, the script flipped, and I began to do things just to see how I'll handle them. Or rather, to watch myself grow into them. I think I finally come back to loving myself, in the same way that I can extend that love to others. And while I do love being a part of other people's lives, and I do love watching other people grow, and I love to see them happy, it isn't because I need them to be happy in order to validate myself. At least not anymore. But rather, it's because I want them to be happy. And of course, life isn't perfect. Just because I'm moving past all this doesn't mean it didn't happen. For instance, there are a couple people out there who I've antagonized in the past, who I definitely want to apologize to, but it happened so long ago now, and in retrospect it seemed like such a traumatic experience for them, that I don't want to drag them back into those problems again. And some of those people are out of my reach, and some of those people wouldn't care either way, and some of those people I was never close to in the first place. Maybe I'll say something if I ever see them again. But I think the right thing for me to do is to respect our distance. If you were to ask me right now why I put myself through all of this, not just the recovery, but like the self-assessment and the self-improvement and the growth, I don't think I would say something like, I want to be a better person. I actually think that kind of statement is kind of gauche. I don't want to be better than anyone, nor do I think I have to be better in order to suit anyone else. Remember, that's the same kind of mindset that got me here in the first place. What I want to do is be in a position where I can help others. I don't want to be useful like a tool. I want to be kind. I don't want to have all the answers. I just don't want to hurt anyone. I don't want to put myself on a high horse. I don't want to be an arbiter of truth. I don't want to be a role model. I don't want to be brave. I don't even want to be an inspiration. I just want to be me. And with that abuse and mental illness and all that shit behind me, I can finally make that call for myself. I don't feel compelled to be someone who anyone else wants me to be. I don't feel compelled to do anything I decide that I don't want to do. I don't feel compelled to subject myself to anyone else's judgment, because I know that the only person who can know me is me. And I think the only person who can know you is you. Okay, just real quick, some closing thoughts. Again, if you need therapy, seriously consider BetterHelp, link in the description. If you happen to have supported any of my work on Kickstarter, first off, thank you again for your support. Do not blame yourself for any of this bullshit. It's not your fault. I'm so sorry about all the delays. I'm doing the best I can with what I've got here, and you're right, a video game getting slowed down because of the director having to deal with an abusive relationship is weird. Honestly, if anything, I would have never been able to get through all this without you guys, so let's hold on to that thought for a second. And second, I'm probably not going to be posting there for a little while because one, I don't have anything to show, and two, it's still really psychologically fraught. But do know that my hiatus is over and I am back to work again. In fact, I've been off hiatus for like months now, probably since like November or December, and I've just been keeping quiet about it because I don't really have anything to say and I'm trying to avoid starting any drama. Although I do recognize that is more or less out of my control. Anyway, if you know any other content creators dealing with their own mental health problems, please don't be too hard on them. You might not realize it, and honestly, we probably shouldn't even do this, but we can pay a lot of attention to the quote-unquote little things. Even just comments like, that sounds like a nightmare, or hope you feel better, or don't worry, take your time. Even if they don't garner a response, can leave a big impact on people like me. I actually remember one person in particular, a commenter on Kickstarter, who said something like, you strike me as a very trusting person. And that person just happens to be the most correct person in the world! It's crazy! They might not ever realize it, especially because I didn't actually respond, but that line really stuck with me, partly because how ludicrously insightful they were, considering they had only ever quote-unquote interacted with me through my incredibly compromised updates. I actually think this might have been my very first step toward recovery, just like that first realization that something was wrong. Just some mysterious stranger who I'd never met before throwing out the hardest read in the world! If that person is watching this video, thank you so much. I'm so sorry that I've forgotten your name, and I'm not ready right now to just look at the Kickstarter page and see who I'm talking about. And not every interaction with my fan base is like this. I also get my fair share of invasive superfans who want in on my personal life, and harassment from people who don't think I'm working fast enough, and even super entitled would-be backseat game devs. And honestly, all of these people I have no idea how to deal with. But to me, the good ones totally outweigh the bad ones. And I know it's easy to forget sometimes, between the impersonality of PR and the nature of parasocial relationships and the limitations of social media. And obviously this is a cliche, and I think I'm lifting this phrase in particular from Nintendo, but this is what I mean. This is what people mean when I say thank you for your support. In the indie world, where there's a whole $2 to go around and teams can be counted on your fingers, somewhere on the other side of the screen is a person. A person with their own circumstances, who can make their own mistakes, who can forget things, who can misremember things, who gets angry, who gets sad, who's dealing with their own problems like everyone else. So thank you, again, for treating people like me like people. Again, I apologize if this video contains any outright misinformation. Just because I've done the research does not necessarily mean my read is airtight, and again, I encourage you to do your own research. There is a wealth of information out there, like one Google search away, and I'll have links to my sources, so videos, articles, and studies, either in the description or in the comments. I would also really appreciate it if people didn't start harassing me, or anyone I know or have known, to know more about my abuse. Like, even this fucking monster of a video is glossing over the full story. I've basically only talked about my recovery and the effects of abuse on me because I just don't want to talk about it. And I'm sure everyone else feels the same way. Like, while I do want to help people and even help them learn from my mistakes, I'm trying to move on with my life. And frankly, while I'm putting on a brave face, at least, I can make jokes about it, the wound is still actually pretty raw. Things were still happening in, January. Actually, you might have noticed, I still avoid the word Kickstarter, for instance, which is a really big pain in the ass. Obviously, I apologize for the inconvenience, but at the same time, you can see where I'm coming from here. But my bigger fear is that people will come to me for advice on their own abusive situations, in which case, I'm, again, not a psychologist. I just did my research and went through some shit. I don't have any credentials, I never went to school, I haven't even really read any books. And besides, your story is probably not exactly like mine. Even if you are going through something like what I've been through, you're still gonna have to do that research for yourself. Only you can know what is best for you. Recovery is a road you have to walk yourself. But if you are going through anything like what I went through, keep walking. You'll get there. One step at a time. Thanks again for watching. Don't work too hard out there.